Abigail Reeves tore the rejection letter to pieces, hands trembling with a fury she'd sworn never to show again. 12 years of being called unmarriageable foolish, cursed with a mind no husband could tolerate, and now the richest man in Virginia stood at her door begging for the very gift that had ruined her. Nathaniel Ashford needed her 7 languages, or he would lose everything he owned. Please subscribe and follow this story to the end. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. Abigail Reeves stood at the washstand in her father's old study, tearing the letter into smaller and smaller pieces until her fingers ached, until the paper was nothing but confetti scattered across a desk that hadn't held a living man's ink in 6 years. She let the last scraps fall. She did not cry. She had promised herself, standing in this very room, the first time a suitor's mother called her too clever to be comfortable, that she would never again let a piece of paper decide what she was worth. The letter had come from her aunt in Charleston. Another match proposed. Another match declined, this time by the gentleman himself, a widowed tobacco factor 20 years her senior, who had written in a hand so careless it barely deserved the name that he required a wife who would attend to the household and not the ledgers. Someone had told him about her. Someone always told them about her. She sat down hard in her father's chair, the leather cracked and cool beneath her palms, and stared at the shelf across the room. 7 grammars, 7 dictionaries worn soft at the corners, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, German, Latin, and the smattering of Cherokee her father had picked up trading furs before she was born. He had taught her because there had been no sons to teach, and because he believed foolishly. She sometimes thought now that a mind sharpened was a mind that could never be taken from her. He had been wrong about one thing. A sharpened mind could still be lonely. Miss Abigail. Her housekeeper Ruth stood in the doorway, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. Ruth had been with the Reeves family since Abigail was a girl, and she had a way of looking at her that said she already knew what was in the torn letter without being told. "You didn't touch your breakfast." "I wasn't hungry." "You're never hungry after the post comes." Ruth crossed the room and began gathering the scraps of paper into her apron, not unkindly, the way a woman clears away a mess that has become familiar. Another one turned tail. He wanted a wife who wouldn't embarrass him with her Latin at supper parties. Abigail almost laughed. Almost. I believe those were his exact words, relayed secondhand, of course. Gentlemen rarely have the courage to say such things to my face. Well, Ruth straightened hands full of torn paper. His loss, and a considerable one. Any man fool enough to fear a woman who can outread him don't deserve breakfast in this house, let alone a wife in his bed. You say that every time. Because it's true every time. Ruth paused at the door. There's a fine line, Miss Abigail, between a woman who's given up and a woman who's simply waiting for someone worth the trouble. You mind you stay on the right side of it. Abigail didn't answer. She had heard this speech in a dozen forms over a dozen years, and she no longer knew if she believed it. 29 years old. Unmarried, living alone in her father's house on the edge of Richmond with nothing but his books and his debts to keep her company. She had stopped waiting for someone worth the trouble a long time ago. She had started instead simply enduring. She did not know, standing in that quiet study with torn paper on the floor, that by sundown a carriage bearing the Ashford crest would be waiting outside her gate, and that the man inside it would need her more than any suitor ever had. 15 miles east, in the great hall of Ashford Hall, Nathaniel Ashford was losing everything he had built, one mistranslated word at a time. Monsieur Ashford. The Frenchman across the long table, a shipping agent named Delacroix, representing merchant houses in New Orleans, spoke slowly, as though addressing a child, though his English was better than most Virginians gave him credit for. I have said this 3 times now. The terms of the canal rights as your man has written them do not match the terms I agreed to in Baton Rouge. That's not possible. Nathaniel's voice was level, but only just. He had built that levelness over 15 years of business, and he was not about to let it crack in front of a room full of men waiting to see him fail. Mr. Pruitt translated every clause himself. Beside him, Elias Pruitt, the young clerk, who had until this morning been the only man in 3 counties Nathaniel trusted with French correspondence, sat pale and silent, his collar damp with sweat. "Mr. Pruitt," Nathaniel said, not looking at him. "Perhaps you'd care to explain the discrepancy." Sir, I translated it exactly as—" "You translated canal usage rights transferable," Delacroix cut in, sliding the document across the table, "as canal ownership permanent. These are not similar words in French, Monsieur Ashford. These are not similar words in any language." A murmur went through the room. Silas Caldwell, seated at the far end of the table, with the easy posture of a man who owned nothing at stake, allowed himself the ghost of a smile. Nathaniel saw it. He filed it away, the way he filed away every small thing Caldwell did, because Caldwell's smiles were never free. "Gentlemen," Nathaniel said, "I'll have the document corrected by morning." "There is no morning, Monsieur Ashford." Delacroix stood gathering his papers with the precision of a man who had already decided how this would end. "My ship sails on the tide in 2 days. If I do not have a contract, I can trust by then I will take my business to the Carolinas, where I am told men read their own agreements before they sign them." He left. His 2 junior partners followed their boot heels sharp against the floorboards and the great hall of Ashford Hall, a room built to intimidate with its high windows and its portraits of Ashfords going back 3 generations, suddenly felt very small. "Well," Caldwell said into the silence, rising unhurried, brushing an invisible speck from his sleeve. "That's a shame, Nathaniel. That canal deal would have fed near 200 families through the winter. Your tenant farmers, your dock hands, the mill workers down at the landing." He shook his head with theatrical sorrow. "Terrible thing losing all that on account of one bad word. You seem remarkably composed for a man who stood to profit from that contract as much as I did." "I stood to profit from a contract." Caldwell smiled fully now, and there was nothing warm in it. "Doesn't have to be yours." He left too, and Nathaniel was alone with Pruitt and the ruins of a deal that had taken 8 months to negotiate. "Sir, I swear to you I translated it correctly. I've studied French since I was a boy. I would never—" "Get out, Elias." "Sir, get out!" Nathaniel did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. It was his late father used to say the most dangerous thing about him, that a man could ruin himself, and Nathaniel would only grow quieter. Pruitt fled, and Nathaniel stood alone in the great hall with 200 families' winter hanging over a single mistranslated clause and 2 days to fix what should never have been broken. He did not believe, not for one moment, that Elias Pruitt had made an honest mistake. He had seen the boy's hands shake. He had seen the way his eyes had cut just once toward Caldwell before the meeting began. But knowing a thing and proving it were 2 different animals, and Nathaniel Ashford had built his fortune on never confusing the 2. He needed a translator. Not Pruitt, not anyone connected to this house, and not anyone Caldwell could reach with a purse of coin or a whispered threat. He needed someone with no stake in Ashford Hall and no love for Silas Caldwell, someone whose French was beyond question and whose loyalty could not be bought because it had never been for sale. He had no earthly idea that afternoon who such a person might be. It was his housekeeper of all people who gave him the name. Mrs. Odell had been with the Ashford family since before Nathaniel's father died, and she had a memory like a ledger book, every debt, every kindness, every scandal in 3 counties filed away and ready for retrieval. She found Nathaniel in his study that evening, staring at the ruined contract as though he could translate it correctly through sheer force of will. "You're wearing a hole in that document with your eyes, Mr. Ashford. I'm short a translator, Mrs. Odell, and 2 days to find one I can trust. There's a woman in town." She said it carefully, the way people said things they expected to be dismissed. "Abigail Reeves, old Josiah Reeves's daughter, the trade clerk who died some years back. I don't know the name. You wouldn't. She doesn't go to your kind of supper party." Mrs. Odell folded her hands. Her father taught her languages the way another man might teach his son a trade French, Spanish, German, more besides. She used to help him with his correspondence before he passed. They say she reads faster than any man in Richmond and speaks better French than half the planters who claim it as a mark of breeding. Then why haven't I heard of her? Because she's an unmarried woman of 29 with no fortune and no father to speak for her, Mr. Ashford, and this county has never once asked what such a woman knows, only what she's worth on the marriage market, and by that measure they've long since written her off. Nathaniel sat with that for a long moment. Can she be trusted? I couldn't say what's in her heart, but I can tell you she's got no love for Silas Caldwell, if that's what you're asking. Something in the housekeeper's tone made Nathaniel look up. Go on. Mrs. Odell hesitated the way a woman hesitates before repeating something that isn't hers to tell. 3 years back, Caldwell courted her, or near enough to it. Called on her regular, borrowed her father's old trade letters to help him with some Spanish correspondence of his own, made her think there might be an understanding between them. Her mouth thinned. Then he up and married Miss Vance from Petersburg, and the whole county heard about it before Miss Reeves did. Caldwell let it be known careless-like that he'd never seriously considered her, said something about a man in his position needing a wife, not a walking dictionary. It was cruel and it was public, and the town has treated her a good deal worse than it treats him for it. Nathaniel felt something shift in his chest, cold and precise. The same feeling he got when he found an error in a ledger that explained a much larger loss. Caldwell had used her once for her mind, and discarded her the moment her use was spent. And now Nathaniel intended to ask the very same thing of her. I don't like what I'm about to do, he said quietly. What's that, sir? Ask a woman to trust a man from this town again, when the last one who did burned her for it. He stood reaching for his coat. Have the carriage brought round. Tonight, sir, it's near dark. I have 2 days, Mrs. Odell. I don't have one to spare on manners. Abigail was in the kitchen with Ruth shelling peas by lamplight, when the sound of carriage wheels crunched up the gravel drive. Ruth went still, first her hands pausing over the bowl. You expecting anyone, Miss Abigail? No one comes calling after dark. No one comes calling much at all. But Abigail had already risen, wiping her hands on her apron. Some old instinct, her father's instinct, the one that made a man straighten his collar before opening a door to a stranger pulling her toward the front hall. The knock, when it came, was firm and unhurried. She opened the door to find a tall man in a dark coat hat, in hand, his face lit gold by the lamp Ruth carried behind her. She did not recognize him, but she recognized the coat, fine wool, the kind that cost more than her father had earned in a year, and the crest stitched discreetly at the cuff. Miss Reeves. His voice was low, careful, the voice of a man unused to asking for things. My name is Nathaniel Ashford. I apologize for the hour. I wouldn't have come at all if I had another choice. Abigail's spine straightened an old defensive posture she'd learned young. Mr. Ashford of Ashford Hall. Yes, ma'am. I don't believe we've been introduced. We haven't. He turned his hat once in his hands, a small nervous motion at odds with his composed voice. I'll be plain with you, Miss Reeves, because I understand plainness is owed to a woman I'm about to ask a great deal from without having earned the right to ask it. I have a contract with a French shipping house that will feed nearly 200 families this winter. Tenant farmers, dock hands, mill workers, men with children, and no other prospects. That contract was mistranslated. Whether by error or by design, I don't yet know, and I have until the tide in 2 days to correct it or lose the whole arrangement. And you've come to me because I'm told you read French better than any man in this county, and I need someone whose loyalty Silas Caldwell can't buy. The name landed in the hallway like a dropped plate. Abigail felt Ruth go very still behind her. She kept her own face carefully arranged, the way she had trained herself to do 3 years ago, in the weeks after the whole town had laughed behind their hands at poor Miss Reeves thought she'd caught herself a husband. You know Mr. Caldwell well, I take it, she said, and was proud of how even her voice came out. Well enough to know he'd sooner see my contract burn than see it signed if there's a way for him to profit from the ashes. Nathaniel's eyes held hers steady. I'm also told he once asked for your help and repaid you with public humiliation. I won't pretend that isn't part of why I'm standing on your porch tonight, Miss Reeves. I need a translator I can trust, and I have reason to believe you'd trust him about as far as I do." Abigail almost laughed, a short, disbelieving sound, more breath than voice. "You've come to my door at 9 o'clock at night to ask me to fix your ruined contract, and your opening argument is that we share an enemy. It's the truthful argument. I find truthful arguments work better than flattering ones in the long run. How refreshing." She crossed her arms. "And what happens, Mr. Ashford, when I've fixed your contract? Do I get sent home with a purse of coin and a polite word never to speak of this again? Or does Richmond hear within the week that Miss Reeves was seen entering Ashford Hall alone after dark? And does my name become a joke told at a different table than the last one?" Something flickered across his face. Not offense, she noted, but understanding, as though the question had landed exactly where he'd feared it might. "I can't promise you what this town will say, Miss Reeves. I've learned better than to make promises about other men's tongues. What I can promise is this: you'll be paid a fair wage for honest work. You'll be treated as the professional you are, and not as an ornament in my hall. And if any man in that room so much as raises his voice to you, he'll answer to me before he finishes the sentence. Bold words from a man who's known me 11 minutes. Then judge me on the next 2 days, not the words." He held out a folded paper, not the contract she saw, but a separate note. "That's my offer in writing, so you needn't take my spoken word for it. Wages, terms, and my signature. You can burn it if you decide against me. But I'd be obliged if you'd read it before you send me back down that drive." Abigail looked at the paper. She looked at Ruth, whose face had gone carefully neutral in the way it only did when she was holding back an opinion by main force. She looked finally back at Nathaniel Ashford, at the exhaustion under his composure, at a man who had clearly spent the whole ride here rehearsing how to ask a stranger for the one thing that might save 200 families from a hard winter. 200 families, she said slowly. "That's not an exaggeration meant to move me. No, ma'am, it's an accounting. I don't deal in exaggeration. I deal in numbers, and the number is 206 households, by my clerk's last count, tied to that canal contract one way or another." She took the paper. She did not open it, not yet, but she took it, and something in Nathaniel Ashford's shoulders eased just slightly, the way a man's shoulders ease when a weight he's been braced against finally shifts. "I'll read it tonight," she said. "I'll give you my answer by morning. That's all I ask." He set his hat back on his head, a small formal motion, and paused on the top step. "For what it's worth, Miss Reeves, I didn't come here because you're the only translator in Richmond. I came here because I made inquiries, and every person I asked said the same thing about you before I ever mentioned your name to Mrs. Odell, that you were the most capable person for the work. Not the most convenient, not the cheapest, the most capable. I thought you should know that's the reputation you've built, whatever this town says about the rest of it." He was gone before she could find an answer to that. She read the letter twice by candlelight, after Ruth had gone to bed, sitting at her father's desk among the last scattered scraps of the morning's rejection, and found the terms exactly as he'd described them. Fair wage, clear language, his own signature at the bottom in a hand as steady as his voice had been. "You're going to say yes," Ruth said from the doorway, not a question wrapped in her shawl against the night chill. "I haven't decided. You've decided. I can see it on you." Ruth came and sat across the desk the way she used to when Abigail was a girl, working through her Latin verbs. "You're scared is what you are. Scared of walking back into a room with Silas Caldwell in it." Abigail's jaw tightened. "I'm not scared of Silas Caldwell." "Then what?" "I'm scared," Abigail said slowly, finding the true shape of it as she spoke, "of wanting something again. Of letting myself believe a man who says the right words at my front door when the last man who said the right words made a fool of me in front of the whole county." She set the letter down. "It's easier to be forgotten, Ruth. It hurts less than being used. Maybe?" Ruth reached across and covered her hand, work rough and warm. "But your father didn't teach you 7 languages, so you could sit in this house shelling peas till you're 80, hiding from men who might disappoint you. He taught you so that when the moment came, and it has come sooner than either of us expected, you'd have something no one could take from you, and no one could talk you out of using." Abigail looked at the letter a long while. 206 households. A man who had said the most capable person for the work, and meant it as praise rather than pity. And underneath all of it, quiet and unwelcome, the memory of Silas Caldwell's face across a supper table 3 years ago. And the particular flavor of humiliation that came from being valuable to a man only in secret. She would not be secret this time. If she walked into Ashford Hall, she would walk in through the front door in the daylight, where everyone could see exactly what she was worth. "I'll go," she said, but not quietly. "If I do this, Mr. Ashford signs that contract with my name on the translation plain for anyone to read. I won't be anybody's hidden advantage again." Ruth smiled slow and proud. "Now that," she said, "sounds like your father's daughter." Yeah. Nathaniel received her answer at first light, a single line in a clean, confident hand. French and English, both, as if she meant to prove her qualifications before she'd even accepted the position. "I accept your terms, Mr. Ashford, on the condition that my work bears my name. I will arrive at Ashford Hall by 9 o'clock. He read it twice, and for the first time in 2 days, allowed himself something close to relief. He did not yet know that Silas Caldwell had spent that same night writing letters of his own, quieter ones. Uglier ones addressed to men who owed him favors and women who loved to talk. All of them designed to make certain that by the time Abigail Reeves walked through the front doors of Ashford Hall, half of Richmond would already be waiting to watch her fail. Nathaniel folded her letter and placed it inside his coat over his heart, the way a man keeps a thing he intends not to lose. 2 days remained before Delacroix's ship sailed on the tide, and somewhere between the ruined contract and the 206 families depending on it, he understood that he had just made the most important decision of the entire negotiation, and it had nothing to do with canal rights at all. It had to do with trusting a woman this town had spent 3 years teaching him to overlook. Abigail arrived at Ashford Hall at 9 o'clock, exactly her father's leather satchel across her shoulder, the borrowed contract folded inside, beside her own dictionaries. She had chosen her plainest gray dress on purpose, nothing that could be mistaken for an attempt to please anyone, nothing that gave the household staff a single thread to gossip about, besides her name. She climbed down from the hired carriage before the driver could offer his hand, and she did not look back at the road behind her because looking back was a habit she'd broken herself of years ago. A young maid answered the door and did not hide her surprise well. "You're Miss Reeves, the translator?" "I am." "I'll fetch Mrs. Odell." The girl hesitated, eyes flicking over Abigail's satchel. Her plain dress, the ink stains still faintly visible on 2 of her fingers despite scrubbing. "Mr. Ashford's sister is here this morning. Miss Charlotte. She wasn't expecting a guest." "I'm not a guest," Abigail said evenly. "I'm employed." The maid didn't answer that. She simply turned and hurried down the hall, and Abigail stood alone in the entryway of the finest house she had ever set foot in, beneath a ceiling higher than her whole cottage, and reminded herself that she had walked in through the front door on purpose, and she would not now shrink from the space she'd claimed. Mrs. Odell arrived first, brisk and kind, ushering her toward the study with the particular efficiency of a woman who had already sensed trouble brewing elsewhere in the house and meant to get Abigail settled before it found her. But trouble found her anyway, in the shape of a slim woman in blue silk, standing in the study doorway, arms folded, blocking it. "So you're her." Charlotte Ashford looked Abigail over the way a buyer looks over a horse she has already decided not to purchase. "My brother's translator. Abigail Reeves." She did not offer her hand, sensing correctly that it would not be taken. "I know who you are, Miss Reeves. Everyone in this county knows who you are." Charlotte's smile had teeth in it. "The clever spinster. Old Josiah Reeves's daughter, who reads better than she keeps house, or so I'm told. Tell me, did my brother explain to you that you'll be working alone with him unchaperoned for however many hours this takes? Because I confess I find it a curious arrangement for a man of Nathaniel's standing." He explained the terms of the work, Miss Ashford. I imagine the standing of the household is his concern, not mine. It's mine as well. I am his sister. Charlotte's eyes narrowed slightly, recalculating. Abigail's calm had clearly not been the reaction she'd expected. You don't seem troubled by the impropriety. I've been troubled by a great many things in my life, Miss Ashford. My reputation surviving one morning in your brother's study isn't among the ones keeping me awake at present. Abigail let the smallest pause sit there deliberate. If you'll excuse me, there's a contract due to sail on the tide tomorrow, and I understand 200 families are waiting on it. She stepped past Charlotte into the study without waiting for permission, and behind her she heard Mrs. Odell make a small sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Nathaniel was already at the long table, sleeves rolled, the ruined contract spread before him beside a fresh copy and 3 sharpened pens. He rose the moment she entered, a small courtesy, but she noticed it the way she noticed everything now, cataloging which gestures were genuine and which were performance. Miss Reeves, thank you for coming. Thank you for asking me at my front door instead of through a letter I might have burned unread. She set her satchel down and drew out her father's old dictionaries, lining them along the table's edge like a soldier arranging weapons before a battle. Shall we begin? I understand we haven't much time to waste on pleasantries. None at all, Nathaniel agreed, and something in his voice, relief maybe, or simple gratitude that she hadn't turned back at the door, made her look up at him for the first time that morning and really see him, tired, shaved too quickly, a man who had clearly not slept. She pulled the mistranslated contract toward her and began to read. It took her 11 minutes to find the first error and less than an hour to find 6 more. Here. She turned the page toward him, tapping the clause with one ink-stained finger. Droit d'usage transferable. This means usage rights transferable. Your clerk wrote ownership permanent. That's not a difficult phrase, Mr. Ashford. A schoolboy in his 2nd year of French wouldn't make that error. You're saying it wasn't an accident. I'm saying I don't know what it was. I only know what the words say, and what your clerk wrote instead. The gap between those two things is too wide to be carelessness. She turned another page. And here this clause regarding the timber rights along the canal bank. Delacroix's original terms specify the timber remains yours. Your clerk's version leaves the ownership ambiguous. Deliberately, I'd guess, so it could be argued either way later by whoever had the better lawyer. Nathaniel leaned over the document, reading where she pointed, his jaw tightening with every line. Caldwell has the better lawyer. He's had one on retainer in Richmond for 3 years. Then I'd say someone was building him a door to walk through, Mr. Ashford, and hoping no one would notice it was there until it was too late to close. He straightened, rubbing a hand over his face. Elias Pruitt didn't have the nerve to plot something like that on his own. I didn't say he planned it. I said someone benefited from it. Abigail dipped her pen and began drafting the corrected clauses in a clean, quick hand, French beside English, her handwriting neat as typeset. Whether Mr. Pruitt is a fool who made an honest mistake, or a frightened young man who did as he was told, is a question for you to answer, not me. My work is the language. Yours is the men. That's a fair division of labor. He almost smiled. Almost. You work quickly. I've had a great deal of practice going unnoticed while working quickly, Mr. Ashford. It's a skill this county has forced on me rather than one I chose. She didn't look up from the page. Now, read this back to me in English if you would. I want a second set of ears before I call it finished. He read it back. She corrected 2 words. And for the next several hours in the quiet of that study, something began that neither of them had a name for yet. Not friendship, not anything so soft, but a working rhythm. Question and answer draft and correction. 2 minds moving at the same pace toward the same target. And Abigail found somewhere in the 3rd hour that she had entirely forgotten to feel like a curiosity on display. She simply felt useful. It had been a long time since anyone had let her feel that. The contract was finished by 4 in the afternoon, clean and correct, and bearing at Abigail's insistence a small notation at the bottom margin. Translation certified accurate by A. Reeves. Nathaniel had looked at that line for a long moment before signing beneath it. "You could have asked for more than a notation," he said. "Most men in my position would have offered you money to keep your name off the page entirely. Discretion, they'd have called it. I don't want discretion, Mr. Ashford. I've had 11 years of discretion. I want my work to have my name on it so that when this contract is read by every merchant in 3 states, there's a record somewhere that a woman did the reading no man in that room could manage." She capped her ink. "Call it vanity if you like. I'd call it overdue." He folded the contract carefully into its leather case. "Delacroix arrives at 10 tomorrow morning. I'd be obliged if you'd be present when he reads it, not to speak unless spoken to, but to answer for the translation if he has questions. I won't have him doubt the work, because he can't see who did it. You want me in the room. I want the truth in the room, and you're the one holding it." He met her eyes steady. "I understand if that's more than you bargained for. I understand what it will mean you being seen there beside me in front of half the merchants in Richmond." Abigail thought of Ruth's voice the night before. It's easier to be forgotten. It hurts less than being used and found, to her own quiet surprise that she was not afraid of the answer she was about to give. "I'll be there," she said. 10 o'clock. "And Mr. Ashford, if anyone in that room questions my translation, I'd rather answer for myself than have you answer for me." Something shifted in his face. Respect plain and unguarded, the first look he'd given her that had nothing to do with need. "I wouldn't dream of taking that from you, Miss Reeves." The great hall was fuller the next morning than it had been 2 days before, and Abigail understood within 30 seconds of entering it that word had already spread. Every eye in the room found her before she'd crossed the threshold. Merchants she recognized from church pews, men who'd sat 2 rows behind her father's coffin and never once called on the widow's daughter afterward, all of them now watching her walk to a seat at Nathaniel Ashford's own table as though she'd sprouted a second head. Silas Caldwell was already seated. He rose when she entered with a courtesy so smooth it made her skin crawl. "Miss Reeves." He inclined his head. "What a surprise. I hadn't heard you'd taken up trade work." "I hadn't heard you'd taken up commenting on other people's employment, Mr. Caldwell, but here we both are doing things we hadn't heard of the day before." She took her seat without waiting for him to pull out the chair, a small refusal that made his smile tighten at the corners. "Still sharp-tongued, I see." "Still accurate, I hope. Sharp and accurate aren't always the same virtue, but I try to manage both." Delacroix arrived at 10 sharp, and the room settled into the particular silence of men waiting to see whether a deal would live or die. He read the corrected contract slowly, his finger tracing each clause, and Abigail watched Nathaniel's hands beneath the table, the way they'd gone still and flat against his knees, the only sign that the man beside her was holding his breath. Delacroix reached the timber clause and paused. "This is different from the previous draft." "Corrected," Nathaniel said. "The original contained an error in translation." "An error." Delacroix looked up first at Nathaniel, then deliberately searchingly at Abigail. "Who corrected it?" "I did." Abigail kept her voice level professional, exactly as she'd have used it if she'd been a man twice her age with twice her reputation. "The original rendered droit d'usage transferable as ownership permanent. I've restored the language to match the terms you agreed in Baton Rouge. If you'll allow me, I can walk you through each corrected clause line by line in French, so you needn't take my English translation on faith." A murmur went through the watching merchants. Caldwell's mouth had gone thin and flat. Delacroix studied her a moment longer, then slid the contract toward her. "Please." She read it to him in French, clean and unhurried. Her father's voice somewhere underneath her own. "A mind sharpened is a mind that can never be taken from you." And when she finished, Delacroix sat back in his chair with the first genuine smile he'd worn since arriving in Virginia. "Monsieur Ashford," he said, "I don't know where you found this woman, but I would suggest you never let her leave your employ." He reached for his pen. "This I can sign." The room exhaled all at once. Somewhere behind her, Abigail heard the scrape of a chair, Caldwell rising, his composure cracking just enough to show the man underneath it. "A remarkable turn of fortune," Caldwell said too lightly. "Funny thing how quickly a ruined contract mends itself once the right translator's found. Almost makes a man wonder how it came to be ruined in the first place." "Almost makes a man wonder," Nathaniel said, not looking at him. "Why you seem so troubled that it didn't stay ruined, Silas." The silence that followed had teeth in it. Delacroix, sensing the current beneath the words, signed the contract without further comment, and the room began to empty, merchants filing out, murmuring to one another. And Abigail caught fragments of it as they passed. The Reeves girl. Would you credit? It reads French better than Delacroix's own man. And beneath the murmur, something colder, quieter, from an older woman she half recognized from the milliner's shop. Well, she'd have to be good at something, wouldn't she? Plain as she is, and unmarried this long. Abigail kept her chin level and did not let her face show that she'd heard it. Caldwell lingered at the door, and as Abigail gathered her satchel, he stepped into her path, not quite blocking her, but close enough that she'd have to step around him to pass, which she suspected was precisely the point. "Miss Reeves." His voice had dropped private, meant only for her. "It's been some years." "It has." "You look well." His eyes moved over her in a way that made her skin want to crawl backward off her body. "Working for Ashford now. I confess I didn't see that coming. Neither did I 3 days ago. Life has a way of surprising a person, Mr. Caldwell. You of all people should understand that." Meaning I understand surprise a good deal better than I did 3 years ago, thanks to you." She held his gaze steady, refusing to let the old humiliation climb up into her throat and choke off the words. "I trust Mrs. Caldwell as well." Well, is something flickered behind his eyes. Not shame. She didn't think Silas Caldwell had the capacity for shame, but a kind of wary recalculation, the look of a man realizing his old leverage had gone soft in his hand. "She is. Very well. I'm glad to hear it." Abigail stepped around him, then unhurried and did not look back, though she felt his eyes on her the whole length of the hall, and understood with a clarity that settled cold and certain in her chest that she had just made an enemy who would not forget the humiliation of losing in front of a room full of men he needed to respect him. The gossip reached her before she'd finished unpacking her satchel that evening. Ruth had heard it at the dry goods store, 3 separate versions already tangled with each other, already growing new details, the way rumor always did. That Abigail Reeves had been seen alone with Nathaniel Ashford for the better part of a day. That she'd humiliated poor Elias Pruitt in front of half the county's merchants, cost the boy his position out of spite. That she'd set her cap for Ashford's fortune the moment Caldwell threw her over, and this translation business was nothing but a clever excuse to get herself into his house. "None of that is true," Abigail said flatly, sitting at the kitchen table, while Ruth banged pots with more force than the cooking strictly required. "Course it isn't true. Truth's never had much say in what this town decides to believe." Ruth set a pot down hard enough to make the table jump. "I'd like to march down to that dry goods store and tell every last one of them what I think of their gossip, but that'd only feed it faster. You know how this works better than I do." "I know how it works." Abigail stared at her hands, at the ink still faintly staining 2 fingers, proof of a full day's honest labor that apparently counted for less in this town than a rumor whispered over flour sacks. "I knew it would happen the moment I walked through that door in daylight. I chose it anyway." "And would you choose different knowing what you know now?" Abigail thought of Delacroix's face when she'd finished reading the corrected clauses. Thought of Nathaniel's flat, still hands beneath the table, unclenching only once the ink was dry. Thought of 206 households that would eat through the winter because of 11 minutes spent finding an error no one else in that room could see. "No," she said, "I wouldn't choose different. Ruth's face softened, and she came around the table to press a kiss to the top of Abigail's head, the way she'd done since Abigail was a girl too proud to cry over a skinned knee. "Then hold your chin up and let them talk. Talk never fed a family or paid a debt. Your work's already done more good in one day than this whole town's gossip has done in 11 years. Nathaniel found her 3 days later, bent over a stack of ledgers in his study, the canal contract long since sealed and sent, and Abigail still very much present in his house, because he had asked carefully, almost hesitantly, as though bracing for refusal, whether she might stay on a while longer to review the rest of his commercial correspondence for similar errors. She had said yes before he'd finished the question. Miss Reeves. He set a fresh stack of papers on the corner of the table, careful not to disturb her current work. I've had the estate's land records brought up from the county recorder's office going back 6 years. I want a second set of eyes on the surveys, particularly the ones touching the canal frontage. If Pruitt's error was deliberate, I want to know what else might have been touched by the same hand. You suspect it goes beyond the one contract. I suspect a great many things I can't yet prove, which is precisely why I need someone whose reading I trust more than my own temper. He hesitated. It's tedious work, Miss Reeves. Deeds, boundary descriptions, old French land grants from before the territory changed hands. I wouldn't blame you for finding it beneath the skill you showed Delacroix. Mr. Ashford. She looked up at him, faintly amused. My father spent 30 years teaching me that no honest work is beneath a mind willing to do it properly. I'll start this afternoon. It took her 4 days to find the first discrepancy, and when she did not call for him gently. She found him in the stable yard, breathless from the walk, ledger clutched against her chest like something that might burn her if she set it down. Mr. Ashford, I need you to see this. He came at once, wiping his hands on a cloth, and followed her back to the study, where she'd laid 3 documents side by side across the table, an old French colonial land grant, brittle with age, and 2 more recent surveys. This grant, she said, tapping the oldest document, describes the northern boundary of the Tanner farm as running to the creek Jusqu'au Ruisseau to the stream full stop. That's the original French dated 1789 before the territory changed hands. It's clear. It's unambiguous. Any child with a dictionary could translate it correctly. Go on. This survey filed 4 years ago describes the same boundary as running to the old creek bed a full quarter-mile short of where the stream actually runs today, because the water shifted its course over 30 years, the way creeks do. She looked up at him. Someone took an old clear boundary and reinterpreted it using a technicality about the water's movement, and in doing so, quietly transferred a quarter-mile of the Tanner family's best bottomland into a parcel now recorded under a different name. Whose name? Abigail turned the survey toward him and pointed to the recording clerk's signature at the bottom, a name Nathaniel clearly recognized because his face went the particular shade of controlled fury she'd only seen once before in the great hall the day the contract nearly died. Caldwell's clerk, he said quietly, filed under Caldwell's clerk's hand. There's more. Abigail's voice had dropped, and Nathaniel understood watching her that she was no longer speaking as a hired translator reporting a curiosity. She was speaking as a woman who had just realized the shape of something much larger and much crueler than a single ruined contract. I found 2 more surveys with the same pattern. Old boundaries clear as day in the original French grants, quietly reinterpreted, using some technical excuse. A shifted creek, a fallen boundary marker, a disputed old fence line, and in every case a small strip of good land moves from a tenant farmer's holding into a parcel eventually purchased cheap by a company registered under a name I don't recognize. What name? Piedmont Land and Canal Company. She watched his face carefully as she said it. Do you know it? Nathaniel was very still for a long moment. I've heard the name. I was told it was a consortium of investors from Richmond unconnected to anyone local. I was invited to buy shares in it myself 8 months ago. His jaw tightened. I declined. I didn't like the men presenting it. Was Caldwell one of them? Caldwell introduced me to them. The silence that followed was heavy enough that Abigail could hear her own pulse in her ears. Outside, somewhere in the yard, a dog barked twice and went quiet, and the ordinary sound of it felt strange, against the size of what had just settled into the room between them. "This isn't a mistranslated clause anymore, Mr. Ashford," she said quietly. "This is farmers losing their land a few acres at a time through paperwork too small and too technical for most of them to notice or afford to fight. This is happening to families who can't hire a lawyer to read a survey the way I can. How many families I've found 3 in 4 days working alone with no idea yet how far back this goes or how many parcels might be touched." She closed the ledger slowly. "If I'm right about the pattern, and if it's been running for years, the way these 3 surveys suggest, the number could be considerably higher than 3. Nathaniel sat down heavily in the chair across from her, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked less like the richest man in Virginia and more like a man staring at a wound he hadn't known he was carrying. "My father built half his fortune trading fairly with these families," he said half to himself, "buying their tobacco at honest prices when other men would have cheated them blind. If Caldwell's been picking their land apart a few acres at a time, under my own roof's shadow, using my own name as cover, because everyone assumes anything touching Ashford land is honest, then he's been using your reputation as a weapon against the very people your father spent a lifetime earning it from." Abigail finished the thought he couldn't. "Yes, Mr. Ashford, I believe that's exactly what's happened." They went to see Josiah Tanner 2 days later in the modest farmhouse Abigail had passed 100 times on the road to town without ever once considering who lived inside it or what they'd lost. Tanner was a broad, weathered man in his 50s, suspicious of the fine carriage in his yard, until Nathaniel introduced himself, and more suspicious still once he understood why they'd come. "You're telling me," Tanner said slowly, standing in his own kitchen doorway with his arms crossed, "that the survey, 4 years back, the one your recorder's clerk did after the flood, that took my creek bottom on purpose. I'm telling you the boundary language doesn't match your original grant," Abigail said carefully. "I can't yet tell you it was deliberate. I can tell you it wasn't honest surveying, Mr. Tanner. The original French grant is clear. The new survey isn't a correction. It's a different boundary altogether, and it happens to favor a buyer with money and connections over a farmer who trusted the recorder's office to do its job." Tanner's wife had come to stand behind him, a thin woman with flour on her apron, and an expression Abigail recognized, the particular exhaustion of people who had long ago stopped expecting justice and started simply enduring the same expression she'd worn herself most mornings before a stranger knocked on her door and asked for help. She hadn't known she had the power to give. "We thought it was the flood," Mrs. Tanner said quietly. "The creek moved after the big flood, we knew that. We didn't think we didn't know there was a difference, ma'am, between the water moving and the paper changing to match some other line entirely. We can't read the old grants. Nobody around here can read French." "I can," Abigail said, "and I did, and I intend to keep reading until I understand exactly how much land and how many families have been touched by this." Tanner studied her for a long moment, then looked past her to Nathaniel. "Why's Ashford's man bringing me this news himself? Could have sent a clerk. Because it happened under cover of my family's name, Mr. Tanner, whether I knew it or not, and I intend to see it undone." Nathaniel's voice was low and level, but Abigail heard the anger held tight beneath it, the same anger she'd heard in the great hall 3 days before Caldwell's smile had gone thin. "You lost land you shouldn't have lost. I mean to see it corrected, and I mean to see the man responsible answer for it, whoever he turns out to be." Tanner's eyes moved between them, the wealthy landowner and the plain-dressed woman with ink-stained fingers, an unlikely pair standing in his kitchen doorway, with news that had turned his whole understanding of the last 4 years on its head, and something in his weathered face shifted cautious hope, replacing suspicion. "We appreciate you coming to tell us plain at least," he said finally. "Most folks with your kind of money wouldn't have bothered." "Most folks with my kind of money didn't have Miss Reeves working for them," Nathaniel said, and Abigail felt the words land somewhere in her chest. She wasn't prepared for warm and unfamiliar, and did not trust herself to answer it with anything but silence. 10. Silas Caldwell learned of the visit within a day. Richmond was not so large a town that a wealthy man's carriage could sit in a tenant farmer's yard without someone carrying word of it back to interested ears. and Caldwell had cultivated interested ears in every corner of the county for exactly this purpose. He came to Abigail's own door this time, not Ashford Hall arriving in the late afternoon, while Ruth was at market, catching her alone in a way Abigail understood at once was deliberate. Miss Reeves. He did not wait to be invited in, stepping half across her threshold, with the easy confidence of a man who had never once been told no and truly believed it. "I think we ought to talk." "I think we ought not, Mr. Caldwell. Whatever business you have, I'd suggest you bring it to Mr. Ashford. This isn't business with Ashford. This is business with you." His voice had lost its earlier smoothness, and underneath it now sat something harder, colder. The voice of a man who had come to negotiate and did not intend to leave without an answer. "I understand you've been doing some very thorough reading of old land surveys, digging up French grants nobody's looked at in 20 years. I understand you have very good sources, Mr. Caldwell, for a man with nothing to hide." "I have sources because I've built relationships in this county for 15 years, Miss Reeves, the kind of relationships that survive a scandal or two, unlike some." His eyes flicked over her, assessing the way they had the night he'd finally admitted he'd never seriously considered marrying her. "I'll be plain with you, since plainness seems to be Ashford's preferred style these days, and I understand you're partial to it. Whatever you think you've found in those old surveys, I'd advise you to set it down, quietly. No further reading, no further visits to tenant farms, no further trouble stirred up over boundary lines that were settled fairly according to the law years ago. And if I don't, then I imagine this county, which has already decided you're a woman who trades her reputation for a wealthy man's attention, will find a great deal more to say about you than it currently does. And I imagine some of what they say might even turn out to be true, given enough encouragement." He let that sit ugly and unmistakable. "You've no father to defend your name anymore, Miss Reeves. No brother, no husband. It would be a shame to watch what's left of your reputation follow the rest of it into ruin, all for the sake of a few acres of creek bottom that don't concern you." Abigail felt something cold and clear settle into her chest, the same steadiness that had carried her through Delacroix's questioning 3 days before. "You threatened me once already, Mr. Caldwell, 3 years ago, when you decided my usefulness to you had run out, and my reputation was a convenient thing to spend on your own advancement. I survived it. I built something out of the wreckage you left behind slowly on my own, with no one's help but my own 2 hands and my father's books. You don't frighten me the way you think you do." "This isn't the same as 3 years ago." "No," Abigail agreed. 3 years ago you only ruined my name. This time you're asking me to help you steal land out from under families who trust the law to protect them and pretend I never saw what I saw. I won't do it. Not for my reputation, not for my comfort, not for anything you could threaten to take from me, because you've already taken the worst of it once, and I found I survived that too." Caldwell's face had gone very still, calculation running visibly behind his eyes. "You'll regret this, Miss Reeves." "I regretted trusting you once, Mr. Caldwell. I don't intend to make that particular mistake twice." She stepped back and set her hand on the door, a clear and deliberate invitation for him to leave it. "Good afternoon." He left without another word, but the look he gave her on the porch step, flat, furious, calculating, told her plainly that the conversation was not finished, only postponed, and that whatever came next would not come as politely as a visit to her front door. She told Nathaniel everything that evening, watching his face harden with each detail, until by the time she finished, his hands had gone flat and still against the study table, in the same way they had the morning the contract nearly failed. "He came to your home, alone, threatened you." His voice had gone dangerously quiet. "He made it sound like advice, Mr. Ashford, but yes, that's what it was." Nathaniel stood, crossed to the window, stood there a long moment with his back to her, and when he turned around, the composure he wore like armor had cracked just enough for her to see the fury underneath it, controlled but unmistakable. "I've known Silas Caldwell 15 years, he said. "Business partner. Guest at my table more times than I can count. I let him into rooms I never let anyone into, because my father trusted his father, and I never once thought to question whether that trust had been earned or simply inherited." He shook his head slowly. I owe you an apology, Miss Reeves. You warned me that first night at your door what it might cost you to walk into this. I told you I'd stand between you and any man who raised his voice. I wasn't there today. You weren't invited today, Mr. Ashford. He came to my door specifically because you weren't present to stop him. Abigail's voice was steadier than she felt. I don't need you standing over my shoulder every hour of the day. I need you to believe what I've found, and to help me finish finding the rest of it before he manages to bury it deeper than either of us can dig. I believe you. He said it without hesitation, and something about the plainness of it, no qualification, no careful hedging, settled something in her chest that had been braced for doubt since the moment she'd walked through his front door 3 days ago. I believe every word, and I intend to see this finished properly in a courtroom in front of a magistrate where Silas Caldwell can't threaten a single soul into silence. That will take more than 3 surveys and 1 tenant farmer's testimony. Then we'll find more. Nathaniel's jaw set the same stubborn line she'd noticed the first night on her porch. How deep are you willing to dig, Miss Reeves? Abigail thought of Josiah Tanner's weathered face, of his wife's flour-dusted apron, and her quiet, exhausted acceptance of a theft she hadn't even known to name. She thought of her father's dictionaries lined up on the shelf at home, worn soft at the corners from 30 years of honest use, and the particular satisfaction of putting them to work for something larger than her own survival. As deep as it goes, she said, however far that turns out to be. It turned out to go considerably farther than either of them expected. Over the following week, working from first light until the candles burned low, Abigail moved through 6 years of county land records with the same relentless precision she'd once applied to her father's trade correspondence, and the pattern she uncovered was worse and larger and more carefully hidden than 3 isolated surveys, 11 parcels, 11 families across 3 years, each one losing a strip of land too small to be worth the cost of a lawyer, too technical in its wording for most tenant farmers to even recognize as theft. Every survey routed through the same recorder's clerk. Every parcel once separated from its original holding, eventually absorbed into land, purchased by the Piedmont Land and Canal Company, the very consortium Caldwell had personally invited Nathaniel to invest in 8 months before, and buried in the oldest of the surveys dated nearly 3 years back. A detail that made Abigail set down her pen and sit very still for a long moment before she carried it to Nathaniel. The recorder's clerk who filed the first altered survey, she said, laying the document before him, signed his name as a witness to the transaction. I didn't recognize the signature at first. I do now. She tapped the name, small and cramped, at the bottom of the page. It's Elias Pruitt, Mr. Ashford, 3 years ago, before he ever came to work for you as your French correspondent. He was clerking for the county recorder's office, and he witnessed the very first altered survey in this whole pattern. Nathaniel stared at the signature for a long moment, and Abigail watched the last piece settle into place behind his eyes. Not an accident, not a single frightened young man making one bad decision under pressure. 2 days before a ship sailed, but a man who had been inside this scheme for years, planted deliberately, moved deliberately into the one household with the resources and the reputation to notice what Caldwell was building, and positioned there specifically to make sure no one ever did. He's been inside my house for over a year, Nathaniel said quietly, reading my correspondence, handling my contracts, and every single day I trusted him with the one thing Caldwell needed controlled most. Mr. Ashford? Abigail kept her voice level, though her own pulse had climbed. If Pruitt has been Caldwell's man from the very beginning, planted in your household on purpose, then the mistranslated canal contract wasn't a mistake at all. It was a test. Caldwell needed to know whether he could still control what left your desk before it reached anyone who could catch it. And when the test failed because you brought in someone Caldwell couldn't buy or frighten, he had to find out exactly how much I'd seen and exactly how dangerous I was going to be. She looked up at him, and for the first time since walking through his front door, she let him see the fear underneath her steadiness, plain and unguarded. He's already come to my home once to threaten me quietly. If he understands now that I found 11 parcels instead of 3, and that I know Pruitt's signature ties it back 3 years, I don't believe his next visit will be quiet at all." Nathaniel was very still for a moment, and then he stood across the room, and for the first time since she'd known him, he reached out and closed his hand gently over hers, where it rested on the table. Not a courtship gesture, not anything improper. Simply the steadying grip of a man making a promise with his whole body, because words alone weren't enough to carry the weight of it. "Then you won't face his next visit alone," he said. "Whatever this costs whoever it touches, I intend to see you safe, and I intend to see him answer for every acre he's stolen. That's not a kindness, Miss Reeves. That's a debt I owe you, and I mean to pay it in full." Abigail looked down at his hand over hers, at the ink still staining her own fingers from a week of relentless work, and felt something crack open in her chest that she had spent 11 years carefully keeping shut. Not romance, not yet. Nothing so simple as that. But the strange, disorienting relief of being believed entirely and without reservation by someone whose belief actually carried the power to change what happened next. "Then let's finish what we started, Mr. Ashford," she said quietly, "before Caldwell finds a way to bury it first." Outside, the light was beginning to fail, and somewhere across the county, Silas Caldwell was already writing letters of his own letters that would reach a magistrate's desk before Nathaniel Ashford's did letters designed to make certain that when the truth about 11 stolen parcels finally reached a courtroom, it would be Abigail Reeves standing accused, not him. The letters Caldwell had written that night reached the county magistrate before the sun was fully up, and by the time Ruth returned from market the next morning, a constable was already standing on the Reeves' front step with a folded paper in his hand and an apology already forming on his lips before he'd even said his name. Miss Reeves. He was a young man barely older than Abigail herself, and he held the summons the way a man holds something he wishes he didn't have to deliver. "I'm sorry to trouble you this early." "What is this?" Abigail took the paper and felt the ground shift slightly beneath her the moment she read the first line. "A complaint has been lodged before the county magistrate alleging that Miss Abigail Reeves did unlawfully remove and copy confidential land office records and did knowingly fabricate false claims against a respected citizen of this county out of personal malice arising from a prior private matter between the parties." "Personal malice," she read aloud, her voice flat. "Prior private matter. I don't know the particulars, ma'am. I'm only asked to deliver the summons. You're to appear before Magistrate Holloway 3 days hence to answer the complaint." The constable shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. "For what it's worth, Miss Reeves, half the men who signed that constable's roster with me this morning didn't much care for carrying it. Word's already got round about what you found out at the Tanner place. Word travels faster than truth in this county. It always has." Abigail folded the paper with hands that did not shake, though everything underneath her skin was shaking plenty. "Thank you for your courtesy in delivering it." He tipped his hat and left, and Ruth came around the corner from the kitchen with flour still on her hands, her face already gone pale with understanding before Abigail said a word. "He's accusing you," Ruth said. "That snake is accusing you. Of stealing records I copied openly with the recorder's own permission, and of lying out of spite because he humiliated me 3 years ago." Abigail sat down hard at the kitchen table, the summons still clutched in her fist. "He's not defending himself against the evidence, Ruth. He's making certain no one ever hears the evidence at all. If the county believes I'm a scorned woman inventing lies to ruin the man who spurned her, then nothing I say about Pruitt or the surveys or the Tanner land will matter. They'll have already decided I'm not to be trusted before I open my mouth." Can he do that? Can a man just say a thing and have it be true because he's the one with money enough to say it loud? He's been doing it for 15 years, Ruth. Why would he stop now on my account? Nathaniel arrived within the hour, having heard the news from Mrs. Odell, who had heard it from the constable's own wife, who had heard it in the way of small counties before the ink on the summons had properly dried. He came through the door without waiting to be announced, and the look on his face when he saw Abigail sitting at her own kitchen table, summons in hand, was not composed at all. The mask he wore in every business dealing had cracked clean through. "I've seen the complaint," he said. "Holloway sent me a copy as a courtesy given my name's tangled up in it, whether Caldwell wants to admit that plainly or not." "Then you understand what he's done." "I understand exactly what he's done." Nathaniel's jaw was tight, his voice low and hard. "He's turned the accusation around before we could bring ours. He knows we don't have enough yet to drag him before a magistrate ourselves, not without Pruitt's testimony, not without more than surveys, and a farmer's word against a man with 15 years of good standing in this county. So he's struck first, and he's struck at the one part of this he knows will hurt worst. My reputation. Your reputation, which this county was already primed to doubt long before either of us ever met." Nathaniel sat across from her, and for a moment his composure slipped entirely. Something raw and furious showing through. "I did this to you. I asked you to walk through my door, told you I'd stand between you and any man who raised his voice, and inside of 2 weeks, you're standing before a magistrate answering for lies Caldwell invented out of thin air. You didn't do this to me, Mr. Ashford. Silas Caldwell did this to me the same as he did 3 years ago, because a woman who tells the truth is inconvenient to a man who profits from lies." Abigail's voice had steadied the shock of the morning, settling into something harder and more useful. "The question isn't whose fault this is. The question is what we do about it in 3 days' time. We fight it." Nathaniel's hand closed into a fist on the table. "We bring Holloway everything, the surveys, the Grant Tanner's testimony, all of it. It won't be enough." Abigail said it plainly without flinching from the truth of it. "You said so yourself not 5 minutes ago. Surveys and a farmer's word against a man with 15 years of standing. Holloway's known Caldwell since they were boys together. He'll want more than paper before he takes a woman's word over a gentleman's, especially a woman that gentleman has already convinced half the county is bitter and spiteful." "Then what do you propose?" Abigail was quiet a long moment, turning the summons over in her hands, and when she looked up, there was something new in her eyes. Not fear, though, the fear was still there underneath, but a hard, clear resolve that reminded Nathaniel, not for the first time, exactly why Caldwell had wanted her silenced in the first place. "We need Pruitt," she said. "Not his signature on an old survey. Him, standing in front of Holloway saying plainly what he did and why he did it. Without that, we have a pattern of suspicious paperwork and a farmer's grievance. With it, we have a confession that ties Caldwell to every stolen acre. Pruitt's terrified of Caldwell. You said so yourself. Then we need to find out what he's more terrified of than that." Abigail stood gathering the summons, her decision already made in the set of her shoulders. "Because in 3 days, Mr. Ashford, I intend to walk into that courtroom, and I do not intend to walk in with nothing but my own word against Silas Caldwell's fortune." They found Elias Pruitt that same afternoon. Not at Ashford Hall. He'd left Nathaniel's employ the day after the ruined contract disappeared into a small rented room above the tannery on the edge of town, but through Mrs. Odell, who had a talent for knowing where every displaced soul in the county eventually landed. He answered his door white-faced and trembling, and the moment he saw Nathaniel standing behind Abigail, he tried to close it again. Nathaniel's hand caught the frame before it shut. "Mr. Pruitt, we only want to talk. I've nothing to say to either of you." His voice cracked on the last word. "I've already lost my position. I've nothing left for Caldwell to take from me and nothing left to give you. You have your conscience, Mr. Pruitt," Abigail said quietly, "and I suspect it's been keeping you awake a good deal longer than you'd like to admit." Something in his face crumpled at that, the particular collapse of a man who has been waiting without knowing it for someone to finally say the thing he couldn't say to himself. He stepped back from the door, not quite an invitation, but not a refusal either, and Abigail took it as the opening it was. "I know you witnessed the first altered survey 3 years ago," she said once they were inside his small, sparse room, "before you ever came to work for Mr. Ashford. I know your signature is on it. I don't believe, Mr. Pruitt, that a young clerk fresh out of the recorder's office invented a scheme to steal farmland on his own initiative. I believe someone showed you exactly what to write and exactly what it would cost you if you refused." Pruitt sat down heavily on the edge of his narrow bed, hands pressed against his face. You don't know what he's like. What he can do to a man with nothing behind him, no family with land, no money set aside, nothing but a clerk's wage and a mother in Petersburg who depends on it. I know a great deal about what it costs to have nothing behind you, Mr. Pruitt." Abigail's voice was gentle now, but unyielding underneath the gentleness. "I've lived it 11 years. But I also know that whatever he's threatened you with, it hasn't let you sleep easy these 3 years, has it? You've been carrying this the whole time. I saw your face the day the canal contract nearly failed. I saw it again the day you fled Ashford Hall. That's not the face of a man at peace with what he's done." Pruitt was silent a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped to almost nothing. "He came to me the week after I started at the recorder's office. Said he had opportunities for a smart young man willing to do small favors, quiet ones, nothing anyone would ever notice. Said the first survey was a simple correction boundary language cleaned up to match the water's true course after the flood. I believed him. I was 19 years old, and I believed him. And after the first one, he had something to hold over me. Said if I ever spoke of it, I'd hang for forgery same as him, only I'd hang alone because a man with his money always finds a way to point the blame downward onto whoever's beneath him." Pruitt's hands were shaking now openly. "Then he got me the position at Ashford Hall, said it'd be useful to have a man inside watching the correspondence. I didn't want it, Miss Reeves. I want you to believe that. But by then, I was in too deep to refuse him anything." "The canal contract," Nathaniel said quietly. "You translated it wrong on purpose. He told me exactly what to write. Said it was only meant to test whether Delacroix's people would notice before the ink dried. Said, if they didn't, there'd be more opportunities like it, bigger ones worth more than any clerk's wage could match in 10 years. Pruitt looked up and his eyes were wet. "I didn't know he meant to steal farmland from families with nothing, Miss Reeves. Not truly, not until I saw the pattern myself, working there seeing which parcels kept crossing my desk. By then I didn't know how to stop it without destroying myself along with him." The room was quiet for a long moment. Abigail crouched down until she was eye level with him the way she might have with a frightened child, though there was nothing soft in what she said next. "Mr. Pruitt, in 3 days, I stand before Magistrate Holloway, accused of lying about everything you've just told me out of nothing more than spite. If you don't come forward, I lose. Not just the case, my name, my standing in this county, whatever small measure of respect I've clawed back in the last 2 weeks. Caldwell wins entirely, and he keeps every acre he's stolen, and he does it again to the next family too small to fight back." She held his gaze. "You said you didn't know how to stop it without destroying yourself. I'm telling you, there's another way to look at that. You can go on carrying this alone in this room for the rest of your life, watching families lose their land, and knowing you helped build the door he walked through. Or you can stand up once, tell the truth once, and however much it costs you, you'll have finally put it down." Mine. Pruitt wept then openly the particular grief of a young man realizing all at once the size of what he'd allowed himself to become. Nathaniel said nothing, letting the silence hold, and after a long while, Pruitt wiped his face with the back of his hand and looked up at both of them with something that might eventually become courage. "He'll ruin me for it. Publicly. He'll say I'm lying to save myself, that I was working alone, that I forged it all without his knowledge." "Then we'll need more than your word too," Abigail said. "Which is why I need you to tell me one more thing. Mr. Pruitt and I need you to tell me the truth of it. Is there anyone else? Anyone who trained you who might have seen this pattern before you ever arrived at the recorder's office?" Pruitt was quiet a moment thinking, and then something shifted in his face. Old Mr. Bellamy. He was the recorder before Caldwell's men got the current clerk installed in the office. Retired now, lives out past the mill. He trained me my first year. If Caldwell's scheme started before I ever joined the office, and I always suspected it did, there were parcels in the record books that troubled me older than my own time there. Bellamy might remember something. Abigail felt her pulse quicken. "Would he testify?" "I don't know. He's an old man now and unwell, I'm told. But he never had any love for Caldwell. Used to grumble about him something fierce before he retired." Pruitt looked between them, something steadier settling into his face for the first time since they'd arrived. "I'll take you to him, tomorrow. And I'll stand before Holloway myself and tell him everything I've told you tonight. You understand what that will cost you," Nathaniel said quietly. "I understand what it's already cost me staying silent." Pruitt stood, and for the first time he looked less like a frightened boy and more like a man beginning slowly to become someone he could live with. 3 years is long enough to carry another man's sins on my own conscience, Mr. Ashford. I'd rather lose everything telling the truth than keep it a moment longer telling his lies." They rode out to Bellamy's cottage the next morning and found the old recorder exactly as Pruitt had described him. Frail, slow-moving, one hand trembling faintly with a palsy that had ended his working life 2 years before. But his mind, when Abigail began asking careful questions about the county's old boundary records, proved sharper than his body. And his memory, once prompted, unspooled with a precision that made her pulse quicken with every sentence. "The Tanner boundary," Bellamy said, settling deeper into his chair, eyes distant with recollection. "I remember it well enough, though it's been some years. There was a pushback before I retired to have several of the old French grants along the canal frontage resurveyed. Official reason given was the flood damage, waters shifting course records needing to be brought current." He shook his head slowly. "I never trusted the reasoning. Floods shift a creek a few yards here and there. They don't shift a boundary line a quarter mile, not honestly." "Did you raise your concerns at the time?" "I raised them with the county commissioner overseeing the recorder's office. Man by the name of Whitfield, since passed on himself." Bellamy's mouth thinned with old frustration. "I was told the resurveys had been reviewed and approved by proper authority, and that an old clerk's suspicions weren't grounds to hold up filed paperwork. I was encouraged in no uncertain terms to mind my own recording and leave the surveying to the surveyors." "Do you remember who commissioned the resurveys, Mr. Bellamy?" Abigail leaned forward, and beside her she felt Nathaniel go very still, the way he always did in the moment before an answer mattered more than anything else in the room. "I remember a name came up more than once in conversation, though I never saw it written plain on the paperwork itself. Men like that rarely put their names where a body might find them later." Bellamy's rheumy eyes moved to Nathaniel, then back to Abigail. "Silas Caldwell. Came round the office personal more than once, friendly-like, asking after this parcel and that one. Struck me odd at the time a gentleman of his standing taking such particular interest in old French boundary lines. I didn't think much more of it. Not until years later, when I heard talk of a land company buying up strips of ground all along that same stretch of canal frontage." "Would you be willing to say that before Magistrate Holloway, Mr. Bellamy?" Nathaniel's voice was careful, respectful of the old man's frailty, but there was no mistaking the urgency underneath it. "I understand it may be difficult given your health." Bellamy was quiet, a long moment, his trembling hand resting on the arm of his chair, and when he finally spoke, there was something steely underneath the frailty that reminded Abigail unexpectedly of her own father, in his last months weak in body, but never once weak in conviction. "I spent 40 years keeping this county's records honest, Mr. Ashford, because a family's land is very often the only thing standing between them and ruin, and a false line on a survey can starve a man's children as surely as a bad harvest." His jaw set. "I'm 71 years old, and I've little enough time left to me regardless of what Silas Caldwell might threaten. I'll stand before Holloway and tell him exactly what I told you, and I'll do it gladly, because I should have done it years ago when I first smelled something rotten in those resurveys, and let myself be talked out of trusting my own instincts." Abigail felt something loosen in her chest, the first true breath of hope she'd drawn since the constable had appeared on her doorstep. "Thank you, Mr. Bellamy. I know what it costs a person to speak against a man like Caldwell. I imagine you know it better than most, Miss Reeves." Bellamy's eyes were kind and knowing in a way that told her the county's gossip had reached even this quiet cottage past the mill. "Don't let his lies sit heavier on you than they deserve. A man who has to invent stories to bury the truth is a man who already knows he's lost the argument honestly." So, word reached Caldwell of the visit within a day. Richmond as ever keeping no secrets for long, and he came to Ashford Hall himself the following afternoon, arriving unannounced. His composure stretched thinner than Abigail had yet seen it. She was in Nathaniel's study when Mrs. Odell announced him, and she saw Nathaniel's spine straighten, the same controlled fury from the day of the Tanner visit settling back into his shoulders. "Silas." Nathaniel did not rise. "I wasn't expecting you. I imagine not, given how busy you've been." Caldwell's eyes cut to Abigail, cold and assessing. "Riding out to old Bellamy's place. Digging up a retired clerk's failing memory to prop up accusations you can't otherwise prove. I confess I'm impressed by the effort, Miss Reeves, even if I doubt Holloway will find a senile old man's rambling especially compelling. Mr. Bellamy's mind is a good deal sharper than you're hoping it is, Mr. Caldwell." Abigail kept her voice level, though her pulse had climbed the moment he entered the room. "And I notice you haven't denied that you visited the recorder's office personally more than once, asking after parcels along the canal frontage." Something flickered across Caldwell's face. The smallest crack quickly smoothed over. "A businessman takes interest in land throughout the county. That's hardly evidence of a crime." "No," Abigail agreed. "But combined with 11 altered surveys, a clerk's signature witnessed under duress, and a land company that happens to have acquired every stolen parcel at a fraction of its worth, it begins to look considerably less like idle interest and a great deal more like a pattern, Mr. Caldwell. Patterns are difficult things to argue away once a magistrate starts counting the coincidences." Caldwell's jaw tightened, and for a moment the smooth mask slipped entirely, showing something harder and more dangerous underneath. "You do well to remember, Miss Reeves, that a pattern built on a frightened clerk's testimony and a dying old man's memory isn't proof. It's speculation dressed up to look convincing. And speculation has a way of collapsing entirely once the men behind it start remembering exactly how much they have to lose by continuing to speak." "Is that a threat, Silas?" Nathaniel's voice had gone very quiet, very still. The tone Abigail had learned meant he was closer to losing his composure than his level words suggested. "It's an observation, Nathaniel, from a man who's watched you throw away 15 years of friendship over the word of a woman with every reason in the world to want to see me ruined." Caldwell's eyes moved back to Abigail, and there was something almost pitying in them now, cruel in its gentleness. "I did wrong by you 3 years ago, Miss Reeves. I've never denied that plainly, whatever this county chooses to believe about my intentions at the time. But wounded pride doesn't make a woman a reliable witness. It makes her a dangerous one, willing to say almost anything to see the man who spurned her brought low. You mistake wounded pride for something else entirely, Mr. Caldwell." Abigail's voice did not waver, though something cold and furious had settled behind her eyes. "I don't need you brought low to feel whole. I stopped needing your good opinion the day you made it plain in front of half this county exactly how little you'd ever thought of me. What I need now has nothing to do with you at all, and everything to do with families like the Tanners, who trusted this county's records to protect what little they had, and found instead that a wealthy man's greed had quietly stolen it out from under them while they slept." The room was silent a long moment. Caldwell studied her, some final calculation running behind his eyes, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped into something almost gentle, almost reasonable, which somehow made it more chilling than any threat he'd voiced before. 3 days, Miss Reeves. I'd think carefully in that time about exactly how much you're willing to lose proving a point that won't in the end change very much for anyone. Bellamy's testimony will be dismissed as an old man's confusion. Pruitt's will be dismissed as a frightened clerk trying to save his own neck by inventing a conspiracy larger than himself. And yours. He let the pause sit, deliberate and cruel. Yours will be dismissed as precisely what half this county already believes it to be. A bitter woman's revenge dressed up in borrowed respectability, courtesy of a wealthy man foolish enough to let her into his house. He left without waiting for an answer, and the study was quiet a long while after the sound of his carriage faded down the drive. "He's frightened," Abigail said, finally into the silence. "Whatever else that was Mr. Ashford, that was a frightened man. He wouldn't have come here himself, wouldn't have risked being seen threatening me in your own study if he believed Bellamy's testimony was as weak as he claims. I know. Nathaniel's hands had curled into fists on the table. But he's not wrong about one thing. This county has already half decided what to believe about you, and 3 witnesses won't undo 11 years of that decision in a single afternoon before Holloway. Quote, Charlotte Ashford arrived that same evening, summoned by rumor faster than any letter could have traveled, and the confrontation Abigail had been quietly dreading since her first morning in this house finally came to its head in the front hallway, loud enough that Mrs. Odell discreetly closed the study door to spare the servants the spectacle. Have you lost your mind entirely, Nathaniel? Charlotte's voice carried even through the closed door, sharp with a fear that Abigail recognized underneath the anger as genuine. The whole county is saying you've allied yourself against Silas Caldwell on the word of a woman with a grudge. And now you mean to drag our family's name through a public hearing over farmland that was never ours to begin with. The land wasn't Caldwell's to steal either, Charlotte. That's not the point, and you know it isn't. Something in Charlotte's voice cracked just slightly. Father spent 30 years building this family's standing in this county. One scandal, one public humiliation before Holloway, and every deal you've built since his death could crumble with it. Investors don't trust a man whose name is tangled up in accusations of theft and forgery, whatever the truth of it turns out to be. The accusation alone is enough to ruin us, Nathaniel, whether you win before Holloway or not. Then I suppose you'd rather I let 11 families go on losing their land in silence, so long as our name stays untangled from the mess of it. I'd rather you let someone else fight this battle, someone with less to lose than the entire Ashford fortune. Charlotte's voice broke fully now raw underneath the anger. You've known this woman 2 weeks, Nathaniel. 2 weeks, and you're prepared to burn down everything Father built, defending her honor against Silas Caldwell, a man you've called friend for 15 years. There was a long silence, and when Nathaniel spoke again, his voice had gone quiet in the way that Abigail, listening despite herself from the other side of the door, had come to understand meant he was more certain than he had ever sounded in any negotiation she'd witnessed. I've known Silas Caldwell 15 years, Charlotte, and in all that time, I never once questioned whether his fortune was built honestly because I never had reason to look closely enough to find out otherwise. I've known Miss Reeves 2 weeks, and in that time she's shown me 11 stolen parcels, a frightened clerk's confession, and an old man's memory that took real courage to offer all of it pointing the same direction. I'm not choosing her over our family's name, Charlotte. I'm choosing the truth over a friendship I should have questioned a long time ago. And if Holloway rules against her, if the whole county decides she invented this out of spite, and drags our name down with her regardless of what's true, then I'll have lost a friendship I shouldn't have kept and gained nothing but the county's doubt. But I won't have let a woman stand alone before a magistrate accused of lying about a crime I know to be real, simply because standing beside her cost me something. His voice softened just slightly. Father built this family's name trading fairly with people who had every reason to distrust a wealthy man's word. I don't think he'd thank me for protecting that name by staying silent while Caldwell finished stealing from the very families Father spent his life dealing honestly with. Charlotte had no answer for that, or none she was willing to voice. And a moment later, Abigail heard the front door open and close hard, and the sound of a carriage pulling away too fast down the drive. Nathaniel came into the study a few minutes later and found Abigail standing near the window, having not quite managed to look as though she hadn't heard every word. I'm sorry you heard that. I'm not. Abigail turned to face him, something unsteady in her chest that she didn't yet trust herself to name. I needed to hear it, Mr. Ashford. I needed to know whether what you're risking is something you understand plainly or something you'll regret the moment it costs you what your sister just described. I understand it plainly. He crossed the room, stopping close enough that she could see the exhaustion under his eyes, the toll of the last 2 weeks written into every line of his face. I've understood it since the night I stood on your porch and asked you to trust a man from this town again, when the last one who asked burned you for it. I don't intend to be the second man who does that to you, Miss Reeves, whatever it costs the Ashford name to keep that promise. Something in Abigail's chest gave way entirely at that, the last careful wall she'd kept between them cracking without her quite deciding to let it. She did not step back. Neither did he. And for a long moment, standing in the quiet study with Charlotte's carriage wheels still fading in the distance, neither of them said anything at all because there was nothing left to say that the silence between them wasn't already saying more honestly. The morning of the hearing arrived gray and close, the kind of heavy summer air that promised a storm before noon, and Abigail dressed with more care than she had in 11 years, not out of vanity, but because she understood walking into that courthouse that every detail would be read as evidence by a room already primed to doubt her. Ruth fussed over her collar in the front hall, hands trembling slightly despite her best effort to hide it. "You look every inch a respectable woman, Miss Abigail. Let them look at you and see that plain whatever lies Caldwell's dressed up to say otherwise." "Thank you, Ruth. I mean it." Ruth caught her hands, held them a moment. "Your father would be prouder of you this morning than he ever was of any translation you finished for him. You remember that whatever happens in that courtroom today." The courthouse was already crowded when their carriage arrived. Word had spread through the county, exactly as Caldwell had intended it would, and Abigail felt every eye in the room find her the moment she stepped through the door. The same weight of scrutiny she'd carried into Ashford Hall's Great Hall 2 weeks before, only heavier now, sharper edged with the particular cruelty of a crowd that had already half decided her guilt before a word of testimony had been spoken. Nathaniel was beside her, and Elias Pruitt sat pale and rigid in the row behind, and old Mr. Bellamy had been brought by carriage wrapped against the summer damp, despite the warmth his trembling hands folded carefully in his lap. Josiah Tanner had come too, standing at the back of the room with his hat in his hands, his weathered face set and grim. Magistrate Holloway took his seat, a heavy-set man with a reputation for patience that Abigail hoped more than she had hoped for anything in 11 years would prove sturdier than his old friendship with Silas Caldwell. "We're gathered," Holloway began, "to hear a complaint lodged by Mr. Silas Caldwell against Miss Abigail Reeves, alleging theft of confidential land records and the deliberate fabrication of false claims. Mr. Caldwell, you may present your case." Caldwell rose smooth and composed once more, every trace of the raw threat Abigail had heard in Nathaniel's study now polished away beneath a gentleman's careful courtesy. He addressed the room as though delivering a eulogy, sorrowful and reluctant, a man forced by unfortunate circumstance to defend his own good name. "Magistrate Holloway, gentlemen, I take no pleasure in standing before this court today." His voice carried easily, practiced the voice of a man who had spent 15 years learning exactly how to make a room believe him. "Miss Reeves is known to many of you as a woman of considerable learning, and I do not dispute her intelligence. What I dispute is her motive, and what I ask this court to consider is a history that predates any of these accusations by some 3 years. He produced a small bundle of letters, and Abigail felt her stomach drop before he'd even finished untying the ribbon around them. "These are letters Miss Reeves wrote to me 3 years ago during a period when I called upon her with some regularity before circumstances led me to marry elsewhere." He held them up, not reading from them directly, letting their mere existence do the work his words were building toward. "I do not share these to embarrass Miss Reeves, but because I believe this court deserves to understand the full history of what lies beneath her present accusations against me. A woman-scorned magistrate is not always a reliable witness to a man's character. Sometimes she is simply a woman determined, however unconsciously, to see that man ruined." A murmur ran through the courtroom, and Abigail felt the weight of every eye pressing harder against her. Now the old shame from 3 years ago rising up unbidden, despite every effort she'd made to bury it. She glanced at Nathaniel and saw his hands had gone flat and white-knuckled against his knee. The same controlled fury she'd learned to recognize as his most dangerous state. Holloway's expression had shifted, considering. "Miss Reeves, do you have a response to this characterization?" Abigail rose, and for one terrible moment, standing in front of the crowded courtroom, with her own old letters displayed like evidence of madness. She felt every year of this county's quiet dismissal, pressing down at once the clever spinster, the woman nobody wanted too sharp to be comfortable, and understood with sudden clarity exactly what Caldwell had built this whole performance to accomplish. He did not need to disprove her evidence. He only needed the room to stop listening to it. "Mr. Caldwell is correct," she said, and her voice, to her own faint surprise, came out steady. "3 years ago, he called on me regularly. I believed foolishly, perhaps, that his intentions were sincere. When he married elsewhere, without ever once informing me plainly that his intentions had changed, I was humiliated before this entire county, and I have carried that humiliation quietly for 3 years, while Mr. Caldwell has carried on entirely unbothered by it." She let that sit a moment, watching Holloway's face, watching the room. "But, Magistrate, I would ask this court to consider something plainly. If I had spent 3 years nursing a grudge sharp enough to invent an elaborate fraud against Mr. Caldwell, why would I have waited until now, until I happened entirely by circumstance to be hired by Mr. Ashford to correct a mistranslated shipping contract, to act on it? Why would my fabricated revenge require 11 separate land surveys, a county clerk's sworn confession, and the testimony of a retired recorder with no personal connection to me whatsoever, none of whom I had ever met before 2 weeks ago? A scorned woman's lie is usually simpler than this, Magistrate. It doesn't typically require this much corroborating evidence to sustain it." Holloway's brow furrowed slightly, and Abigail pressed forward before Caldwell could recover his footing. "I would ask this court to hear the evidence itself, rather than the story Mr. Caldwell has built around my character to discourage this court from hearing it. Let Mr. Pruitt testify to what he witnessed and why. Let Mr. Bellamy testify to the pattern he observed years before I ever met Mr. Caldwell socially. Let Mr. Tanner testify to the land his family lost. If after hearing all of it, this court still believes I invented a conspiracy out of wounded pride, I will accept that judgment. But I ask that the evidence be heard on its own merit, not dismissed unheard, because Mr. Caldwell has found it convenient to remind this room of an old humiliation." The courtroom was very quiet. Holloway studied her a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, and then he turned to Caldwell. "Mr. Caldwell, do you object to hearing the witnesses Miss Reeves has proposed?" Caldwell's composure had thinned just slightly, the calculation behind his eyes moving faster now. "I have no objection to this court hearing whatever testimony it wishes, Magistrate. I only ask that the court weigh that testimony against the character of the woman presenting it." "Noted." Holloway's voice had cooled, and Abigail felt the first true flicker of hope since Caldwell had produced the letters. "Mr. Pruitt, the court will hear you first." Elias Pruitt rose pale and visibly trembling, and made his way to the front of the courtroom. He glanced once at Caldwell, a long, fearful look, and then deliberately turned his eyes toward Abigail instead, as though anchoring himself to the courage she'd asked of him 2 nights before. "Mr. Pruitt," Holloway said, "you're sworn to tell this court the truth. Do you understand the weight of that oath?" "I do, sir." Pruitt's voice shook but held. "And I intend to keep it whatever it costs me." He drew a breath, and in the heavy, storm-close air of that crowded courtroom, with Silas Caldwell's eyes boring into him from across the room, and the whole of Richmond waiting to hear which way the truth would finally break, Elias Pruitt opened his mouth to speak, and at that exact moment, the courtroom doors banged open behind them, hard enough to crack against the wall, and a breathless rider stood in the doorway, dust-covered from a hard ride, calling out a name that turned every head in the room and stopped Pruitt's testimony before a single word of it could reach the magistrate's ledger. "Magistrate Holloway, there's been a fire out at the old recorder's office. The county land records, sir, half of them gone before the bucket line could reach it. And Mr. Bellamy's cottage." The rider's chest heaved, his eyes finding Abigail across the crowded room, wide with an urgency that turned her blood to ice before he'd even finished the sentence. "Mr. Bellamy's cottage has been broken into, ransacked top to bottom. Whoever did it took every paper the old man had." The courtroom erupted into noise chairs, scraping voices rising over one another, and Holloway's gavel came down twice before the room settled enough for him to be heard. "Order! Order!" He fixed the breathless rider with a hard stare. "Say that again, and say it slower." The recorder's office, sir. Fire broke out sometime before dawn. In the record room, specifically the clerk on duty, says it was set deliberate oil poured along the shelving and half the land books gone to ash before the bucket line could save the rest. The writer swallowed, still catching his breath. And Mr. Bellamy's cottage passed the mill. I rode by it not an hour after on my way here on account of hearing he was meant to testify this morning. Door standing wide open. Every drawer in the house pulled out and dumped. Whoever did it wasn't looking to steal silver, sir. They left the silver sitting plain on the sideboard. They wanted paper. Abigail's hand found the edge of the table before she was aware of reaching for it. Her knees suddenly unsteady beneath her. Beside her, Nathaniel had gone rigid, his eyes already moving toward the courtroom doors, as though he meant to ride for Bellamy's cottage himself that instant. "Is Mr. Bellamy?" Her voice came out thinner than she wanted it to. "Is he hurt?" "He weren't at home when it happened, ma'am. Neighbor says his grandson fetched him early on account of the damp aggravating his chest, took him to stay the night at the grandson's place nearer town. That's like as not the only reason he's not lying hurt in his own front room right now." The writer shook his head. "But every paper in that cottage is gone. However he meant to back up his testimony today, whatever he had written down. He didn't need it written down." Abigail's voice found its steadiness again, sharp and certain, cutting through the murmur still rippling across the courtroom. "Magistrate Holloway, Mr. Bellamy's testimony was always to be given from memory, from 40 years spent recording this county's land transactions. A fire cannot burn a man's recollection. Whoever ordered that cottage search this morning was hoping to frighten an old man into silence, or to destroy some document they believed existed that they were never going to find because it was never on paper to begin with." Caldwell had risen from his seat, his face arranged into careful, sorrowful concern, though Abigail did not miss the way his eyes had gone flat and calculating the moment the writer mentioned the fire. "A terrible business," he said smoothly. "Though I confess, magistrate, I fail to see what bearing an unfortunate fire has on the matter presently before this court. If anything, the loss of the county's original land records makes Miss Reeves's claims considerably harder to substantiate, not easier." "Convenient, isn't it?" Nathaniel said low and hard, rising to his feet beside Abigail. "That the exact record supporting her claims happened to burn the very night before this hearing, and the one witness holding the oldest memory of that pattern happened to have his home ransacked the same night. Are you accusing me of arson, Nathaniel?" Caldwell's voice had an edge to it now, all pretense of sorrow burned away. "Careful. That's a serious charge to level without proof, and I'd remind this court that proof seems to be in rather short supply on your side of this argument this morning." Holloway's gavel came down once more sharp. "Enough, both of you." He sat back studying the room with the weary expression of a man who had hoped for a simple hearing and found himself instead standing at the edge of something considerably larger. "Mr. Pruitt was in the process of giving sworn testimony when we were interrupted. I intend to hear the remainder of it, fire or no fire. Mr. Pruitt, you may continue." Pruitt, who had gone gray-faced during the commotion, stepped forward again, and this time when he spoke, something in his voice had hardened, as though the news of the fire had stripped away whatever last hesitation remained in him. "3 years ago," he began, "I was clerking in the county recorder's office, newly hired, not yet 20 years old. Mr. Silas Caldwell came to call on me there, not once but several times over the course of that first month, always friendly, always generous with his time toward a young clerk. Most gentlemen of his standing wouldn't have troubled to notice." He drew a breath. "He told me he had opportunities for a smart young man willing to do small favors, quiet ones. He showed me an old French land grant along the canal frontage, the Tanner boundary, and told me the water had shifted since the original survey, and that the record simply needed updating to reflect the truth of where the creek now ran." "And you believed him?" Holloway said not unkindly. "I believed him, sir, because I was 19, and he was Silas Caldwell, and it did not occur to me that a man of his standing would trouble himself to deceive a clerk over a few acres of bottomland." Pruitt's voice shook, but did not stop. I wrote the survey the way he described it to me. I did not understand not truly what I had done, until considerably later when I saw the pattern repeat itself. Parcel after parcel, always the same excuse. A shifted creek, a fallen marker, a disputed fence line, and always eventually the land ending up in the hands of a company called Piedmont Land and Canal. And who controls that company, Mr. Pruitt, to your knowledge? Pruitt's eyes flicked once to Caldwell, and then held there steady, the fear in them burning down into something closer to resolve. I was never shown a deed naming him directly, sir. Men like Mr. Caldwell are careful about that. But I carried messages between him and the company's Richmond agents on 4 separate occasions. Sealed letters I was told never to read. Though I confess, curiosity got the better of me once. The instructions inside concerned which parcels to purchase next and at what price. And they were signed with his own hand, not with the name of any proxy or agent. I saw his signature, Magistrate. I would know it anywhere. A ripple went through the courtroom, and Abigail watched Holloway's face shift, the careful neutrality of a magistrate beginning to crack under the weight of specific damning detail. "That is a serious accusation, Mr. Pruitt," Holloway said slowly. "Are you certain of what you saw?" "I am certain, sir, because I have spent 3 years unable to forget it." Pruitt's voice broke slightly on the last words, and he did not try to hide it. "I have watched families lose land they didn't know how to fight for, and I have said nothing because I was told plainly that if I ever spoke of it, I would hang for forgery alongside him only alone, because a man with his money always finds a way to point blame downward onto whoever stands beneath him. I am speaking now because I would rather hang telling the truth than live another year carrying his lies." The courtroom had gone very quiet. Caldwell's composure, Abigail noted, had not cracked entirely, but something in his posture had changed. A stillness that read less like confidence now, and more like a man recalculating how much damage had already been done and how much more he could still contain. "Mr. Caldwell," Holloway said, "do you wish to respond to these specific claims?" "I do, Magistrate, and gladly." Caldwell rose, smoothing his coat, and when he spoke again, his voice had regained its earlier polish, though Abigail could hear the effort it cost him to hold it there. "Mr. Pruitt is a frightened young man who has just lost his position, his reputation, and by his own admission, his peace of mind over these last 3 years. I do not doubt that he believes what he's telling this court. But I would ask the court to consider, is it not equally possible that Mr. Pruitt, having altered these surveys entirely on his own initiative, out of greed or ambition beyond his station, has now constructed an elaborate story implicating me, a wealthy man with no need of a 19-year-old clerk's cooperation, simply to save his own neck from the consequences of what he alone did?" "That's a fair question to raise, Mr. Caldwell," Holloway allowed, "but it requires some answer as to motive. Why would Mr. Pruitt alter these surveys alone with no benefit to himself, beyond considerable risk? Men do foolish things for money they don't yet have the wisdom to manage, Magistrate. Perhaps he was offered a bribe by someone else entirely, someone with genuine interest in that farmland, and has now faced with exposure chosen the more sympathetic story of a frightened boy, coerced by a powerful man rather than admit to his own greed." It was, Abigail thought, watching Caldwell work the room, a genuinely skillful lie, plausible enough to plant real doubt, cruel enough to shift the entire weight of blame back onto a boy who had already suffered 3 years for his silence, and was now suffering considerably more for breaking it. She saw Holloway's brow furrow, saw the room's sympathy so recently tilted toward Pruitt begin to waver uncertainly. She rose before she'd fully decided to. "Magistrate, if I may." "Miss Reeves, Mr. Caldwell asks this court to believe that Mr. Pruitt invented an elaborate scheme entirely alone at 19 years old with no experience in land law and no connections to a company like Piedmont Land and Canal, and that he has now compounded that invention by fabricating a story naming a specific wealthy, well-connected man as his accomplice, a man who could destroy him utterly for the accusation alone." She let that sit a moment. "I would ask this court to consider which story requires more invention. A frightened boy coerced by a man he had every reason to fear, and no power to refuse doing as he was told, and living 3 years in silence out of terror. Or that same boy alone orchestrating a multi-year land fraud sophisticated enough to survive undetected, and then choosing of his own free will to accuse the single most dangerous man in this county of complicity, for no reason except to make his own punishment worse. Holloway said nothing, but his eyes had narrowed slightly, weighing. Furthermore, Abigail continued, Mr. Caldwell suggests someone else entirely might have bribed Mr. Pruitt. I would ask him to name that person if he believes it. A vague suggestion of an unnamed third party is not an alternative explanation, Magistrate. It is simply another way of asking this court to doubt the only concrete testimony offered so far without providing anything concrete to doubt it with. Caldwell's jaw tightened visibly, and for the first time that morning, he did not have an immediate answer ready. The silence stretched a beat too long before he recovered. I am not obligated to solve this court's mystery for it, Miss Reeves. I am merely pointing out that Mr. Pruitt's story, however dramatically delivered, remains unproven. Then let us prove it, Abigail said, and reached into her satchel. Tund. The room went very still as she withdrew a thick, carefully bound sheaf of papers, not the original surveys which had burned that very morning in the recorder's office fire, but something else entirely, and she watched Caldwell's composure finally fully crack as he understood what she was holding. Magistrate Holloway. When I began reviewing the county's land records 2 weeks ago, I made a personal decision out of an abundance of caution. I confess I did not fully understand the wisdom of at the time. I transcribed every document I examined in my own hand, complete and exact, and I kept those transcriptions not at Ashford Hall and not at the recorder's office, but in my own home, in a location known to no one but myself and my housekeeper. She set the sheaf on the table before Holloway. These are certified true copies of all 11 altered surveys alongside the original French grant language, for each copied word for word before this morning's fire ever had the chance to destroy the originals. I am prepared to swear before this court that every word in these pages matches the documents I personally examined in the recorder's office, under the recorder's own supervision with his full knowledge and permission. Mimier. Holloway leaned forward, taking the papers, turning through them slowly, his expression shifting from careful neutrality into something considerably sharper. These are remarkably thorough, Miss Reeves. I was taught, Magistrate, that a mind sharpened is a mind that can never be taken from a person. I did not know when my father taught me that lesson that it would one day mean copying land surveys by candlelight until my hand cramped in case someone decided burning the originals was easier than disproving them honestly. But I am glad this morning that I listened to him. A sound rippled through the courtroom. Not quite laughter, but something close to it. A kind of startled, admiring murmur. And Abigail saw for the first time since she'd walked through those doors several faces in the crowd looking at her with something other than suspicion. Caldwell had gone very pale. Those documents are worthless without the originals to verify them against Magistrate. Miss Reeves could have written anything in that sheaf. There is no way now to confirm whether her transcriptions match the burned records at all. There is one way, Nathaniel said quietly, rising beside Abigail. Mr. Bellamy examined those same original surveys years before Miss Reeves ever saw them in his capacity as recorder. His memory of the original boundary language given independently without ever seeing Miss Reeves's transcriptions would either confirm or contradict what she's written here. If his account given from memory alone matches her transcriptions detail for detail, I don't see how this court can reasonably continue to doubt either of them. Holloway considered this a long moment, then nodded slowly. Mr. Bellamy is not present given this morning's events, but if his health permits, I want him before this court by tomorrow morning to give his testimony independently, without sight of Miss Reeves's transcriptions beforehand. This hearing is recessed until then. They found Bellamy at his grandson's house on the edge of town, shaken but unharmed, sitting near the fire with a blanket over his knees. Despite the summer warmth, his trembling hands wrapped around a cup of tea. He wasn't drinking. "They tore my house apart," he said when Abigail and Nathaniel were shown in. 40 years of records, letters, my late wife's correspondence, all of it scattered across the floor like so much kindling. I don't know what they were looking for, but I thank God my grandson fetched me before whoever it was arrived to look for it in person. We believe they were looking for anything that might confirm what you were prepared to tell Holloway," Abigail said gently, kneeling beside his chair. "Mr. Bellamy, I know this has frightened you badly, and I would understand entirely if you wish to withdraw from testifying tomorrow. No one would think less of you for choosing your own safety." Bellamy was quiet a long moment, his rheumy eyes fixed on the fire, and when he finally spoke, his voice, though still trembling with age, had steadied with something that reminded Abigail powerfully of her own father in his final months. "I told you once already, Miss Reeves, that I spent 40 years keeping this county's records honest, because a false line on a survey can starve a man's children as surely as a bad harvest." His jaw set. "Whoever tore my house apart this morning only confirmed to me that I was right to be troubled by those resurveys years ago, and that I was a coward not to fight harder when Whitfield told me to mind my own recording and leave the surveying to the surveyors. I don't intend to be a coward twice in one lifetime, however many years I have left in me. I'll be there tomorrow, and I'll tell Holloway exactly what I remember, and God willing my memory will match whatever Miss Reeves managed to write down before they burned the proof of it." "Thank you, Mr. Bellamy," Nathaniel said quietly. "I'll have my own men posted outside this house tonight and outside the courthouse tomorrow. Whatever else happens, no one will trouble you again while this is unresolved." Word of the fire and the break-in spread through Richmond faster than any hired rider could have carried it alone. And by the time the hearing reconvened the following morning, the courtroom was fuller than it had been the day before. Packed with merchants and farmers and townsfolk, drawn less by legal interest than by the particular hunger a small county develops for watching its wealthiest citizens finally called to account. Abigail felt the shift in the room the moment she entered. Not warmth, not yet, but something less hostile than the suspicion she'd walked through the day before. Word of her transcriptions had traveled too, and whatever this county still believed about her private history with Caldwell, there was a grudging respect now in the way several eyes followed her to her seat. The particular respect of practical people reserve for someone who has proven plainly that they were prepared for exactly this kind of trouble. Bellamy was brought in by carriage wrapped against a chill only he seemed to feel, and settled carefully into a chair near the front Holloway himself, rising briefly to see him seated with more courtesy than Abigail had yet seen the magistrate extend to anyone in this proceeding. "Mr. Bellamy," Holloway said once the room had settled, "you're aware this court is asking you to testify from memory regarding the original boundary language of several land grants along the canal frontage, and that your account will be compared afterward against transcriptions Miss Reeves prepared independently without your knowledge of their content." "I understand, Magistrate." "Then please in your own words describe what you recall of the Tanner boundary as it was originally recorded before any resurvey." Bellamy closed his eyes briefly, gathering the memory, and when he spoke his voice, though frail, carried a precision that silenced the last murmur in the room. The original French grant dated 1789 described the northern boundary as running jusqu'au ruisseau to the stream without further qualification. I recall it distinctly because it was one of the clearer boundary descriptions in that whole stretch of frontage, unusually plain for a document of its age. There was no mention of an old creek bed, no qualifying language about the water's prior course, simply the stream as it ran at the time of any dispute. Holloway turned to the transcriptions before him, running his finger down the page until he found the corresponding entry, and Abigail watched his eyebrows lift slightly as he compared the two. "Word for word, Mr. Bellamy, that matches Miss Reeves's transcription of the original grant." He looked up. "Can you describe the resurvey that replaced it 4 years ago?" Bellamy's account continued parcel by parcel, and Abigail felt her own pulse climbing with each one because each time without exception his independent recollection matched her transcriptions, precisely, not close, not approximately, but exact down to specific phrases and dates. Two accounts built entirely apart from one another, arriving at the identical truth. By the time Bellamy finished working through all 11 parcels with the patient methodical care of a man who had spent 40 years training his mind to hold exactly this kind of detail, the courtroom had gone entirely silent, and Holloway sat back in his chair with the particular stillness of a man who has just watched an argument he'd hoped to find weak instead prove itself beyond reasonable doubt entirely sound. "Mr. Caldwell," Holloway said finally, "I confess I find it increasingly difficult to credit the theory that Mr. Pruitt invented this pattern alone, or that Miss Reeves fabricated 11 separate transcriptions matching in exact and specific detail the independent memory of a retired county recorder with no connection to either of them beyond his former office. Do you have any further response?" Caldwell rose slowly, and for the first time in 2 days, Abigail saw something genuinely unsettled beneath his composure. Not fear exactly, not yet, but the particular tension of a man watching a carefully built structure begin to shift beneath his feet. "Magistrate, I would remind this court that memory, however sincerely offered, is not infallible, particularly in a man of Mr. Bellamy's age and health. And Miss Reeves's transcriptions, however thorough, were made by a woman with a documented personal grievance against me. Coincidence of detail is not proof of conspiracy. It is at most proof that Miss Reeves is a careful record-keeper, which no one here disputes. And the fire, Mr. Caldwell." Nathaniel's voice cut across the room hard and clear. "The break-in at Mr. Bellamy's home the very night before his testimony. Another coincidence. An unfortunate one, certainly, but this county has seen fires before Nathaniel, and it has seen break-ins before, and I would caution this court against assuming every misfortune that benefits my accuser's narrative must therefore have been orchestrated by my hand." Caldwell's voice had regained some of its earlier smoothness, though Abigail could hear the strain beneath it now. "If this court intends to convict a man of forgery and theft on the strength of transcriptions, an old man's memory, and a frightened clerk's uncorroborated accusation, I would ask what has become of the standard of proof this county has always claimed to hold dear." It was, Abigail thought, watching him, his strongest argument, yet not a denial exactly, but an appeal to doubt, to caution, to the particular reluctance a magistrate might feel about ruining a wealthy, well-connected man's name, on evidence that, however compelling, remained circumstantial. She saw Holloway's face weighing it, and understood that whatever certainty had built in the room over the last hour might still not be enough. Not against 15 years of friendship and standing. Without something more direct still to offer, she had not expected the something more to arrive the way it did. A commotion at the back of the courtroom turned every head, and Abigail watched a well-dressed stranger push through the crowd toward the front, a leather case clutched under one arm, his face flushed from hard travel. "Magistrate Holloway." He stopped before the bench, breathing hard, and Holloway regarded him with visible surprise. "Mr. Ferris, I wasn't expecting you in this county. I wasn't expecting to be here, sir, until word reached Richmond yesterday evening of this hearing, and of the accusations being raised against Mr. Caldwell regarding Piedmont land and canal." The stranger Ferris, evidently known to Holloway by reputation, if not close acquaintance, turned to address the room directly. "My name is Charles Ferris. I serve as bookkeeper for Piedmont Land and Canal Company in its Richmond offices. I rode through the night upon hearing what was being alleged here because I believe this court deserves to see the company's true ownership records, which I have reason to believe Mr. Caldwell has taken considerable care to keep hidden." Caldwell's face had gone bloodless. "Ferris, this is entirely inappropriate. With respect, Mr. Caldwell, I no longer work for you exclusively, and I no longer intend to protect what I've spent 2 years quietly suspecting was a great deal more than an ordinary investment consortium." Ferris opened his leather case and produced a ledger worn and heavily annotated, and held it toward Holloway. "This is the company's true ownership ledger, magistrate, kept separately from the public records filed with the state, which list a group of Richmond investors as majority shareholders. In truth, Sir, 71% of Piedmont Land and Canal's shares are held under a single proxy arrangement controlled entirely by Mr. Silas Caldwell, and have been since the company's founding." The courtroom exploded into noise, and this time Holloway's gavel took considerably longer to restore order. Abigail felt Nathaniel's hand find hers beneath the table, gripping it tight, and did not pull away. "Why come forward now, Mr. Ferris?" Holloway asked once the room had settled enough to hear him. "Why not years ago, if you suspected this arrangement was improper?" Ferris's face tightened with something like shame. "Because I was paid well to keep quiet, magistrate, and because a bookkeeper's suspicions are easily dismissed as ignorance of complex investment arrangements, and I told myself for 2 years that it wasn't truly my business to question how a wealthy man structured his holdings." He glanced briefly at Abigail. But word reached Richmond yesterday that a woman had risked her own reputation and safety to expose 11 families losing their land to this very company, and that an old man's home had been ransacked to silence him. And I found I could no longer tell myself this wasn't my business. If Miss Reeves was willing to risk what she's risked, I decided I owed this court the same courage however late it comes. Abigail felt something tighten painfully in her chest, unexpected and overwhelming. Not triumph exactly, but something close to it. The particular vindication of watching a truth she'd fought alone for 2 weeks suddenly gather allies she'd never expected simply because she had refused to stay quiet. Holloway examined the ledger for a long moment, his expression hardening with each page. "Mr. Caldwell, this ledger, if genuine, directly contradicts your public filings regarding this company's ownership. Do you dispute its authenticity?" Caldwell said nothing for a long moment, and Abigail watched something finally break in his composure. Not dramatically, not with any outburst, but with the quiet collapse of a man who understood in that instant that every careful structure he'd built over years had just come apart in front of the one audience he could never afford to lose. "I have nothing further to say to this court," he said finally, his voice flat, stripped of all its earlier warmth, "until I have had the opportunity to consult counsel." "That is your right, Mr. Caldwell." Holloway's voice had gone hard, all trace of old friendship burned away by the weight of what had just been laid before him. "But I am satisfied, based on the testimony and evidence presented over these 2 days, that there is more than sufficient cause to dismiss the complaint against Miss Reeves entirely, and to open a formal investigation into your conduct regarding Piedmont Land and Canal Company. The 11 altered surveys identified by Miss Reeves and confirmed by Mr. Bellamy's independent testimony, and the events of yesterday morning at the recorder's office, and Mr. Bellamy's residence, which this court now views with considerably greater suspicion than it did 24 hours ago." The courtroom erupted, and this time Holloway did not immediately try to quiet it, allowing the noise to run its course while he conferred briefly with the clerk beside him. Abigail sat very still through it, her hand still held tight in Nathaniel's beneath the table, watching Silas Caldwell's face as the room around him celebrated a downfall he had spent 15 years believing was impossible. The formal ruling came an hour later, once the room had settled enough for Holloway to deliver it properly. The complaint against Abigail was dismissed in full, the magistrate noting for the record that her conduct throughout the proceeding had been, in his words, exemplary in its precision and its courage. Caldwell was bound over for further investigation, his assets connected to Piedmont Land and Canal frozen pending the outcome, and a warrant issued for the immediate identification of whoever had set the recorder's office fire and ransacked Bellamy's home, a matter Holloway made plain he intended to pursue with particular vigor, given how directly it appeared connected to obstructing this very hearing. Caldwell left the courthouse under considerably less cover than he'd entered it, the crowd outside parting around him with a coldness that told Abigail watching from the courthouse steps that whatever standing he'd built in this county over 15 years had cracked beyond easy repair. He did not look at her as he passed. She was glad of it. She did not think she could have borne that particular morning whatever look he might have given her. Josiah Tanner found her on the steps a few minutes later, his hat in his hands, his weathered face working with an emotion he seemed to be struggling to put into words. "Miss Reeves." He cleared his throat. "I don't rightly know how to thank a person for what you've done. My wife and we'd about made peace with losing that creek bottom for good. Told ourselves it was just how things went for folks like us against folks like him. You shouldn't have had to make peace with it, Mr. Tanner. It was never his to take. No, ma'am. But knowing a thing's wrong and having the means to prove it wrong in a court of law, those are two different animals, and most folks in my position never get hold of the second one." He shook his head slowly. You risked a good deal standing up in that courtroom against a man like Caldwell. Risked your name, your safety by the sound of that fire and break-in yesterday. I won't forget it, and neither will my wife. And I expect there's 10 other families in this county who owe you the same debt once the dust settles on how many parcels Caldwell's company really touched. Abigail felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. Thank you, Mr. Tanner. That means more to me than I know how to say plainly. He tipped his hat and moved off into the dispersing crowd, and Abigail stood a moment on the courthouse steps. The summer air heavy with the promise of a storm that had never quite broken, and let herself for the first time in 2 exhausting weeks simply breathe. Nathaniel found her there a few minutes later, Ruth having already been swept up in an eager cluster of townswomen, suddenly very interested in hearing every detail of the hearing from someone who'd witnessed it firsthand. A strange, dizzying reversal of the whispers that had followed Abigail through the dry goods store only days before. You did that, Nathaniel said quietly, coming to stand beside her. All of it. The transcriptions, Pruitt's courage, Bellamy's testimony. None of it happens without you walking through my front door 2 weeks ago and refusing to be sent home quietly. You believed me when it would have been considerably easier not to, Abigail said. That matters more than you seem to think it does, Mr. Ashford. I've spent 11 years being told in 100 small ways that what I noticed didn't matter, that what I knew wasn't worth hearing. You never once told me that, not from the first night on my porch. I meant every word of it, I still do. He was quiet a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped into something softer, more uncertain than she'd yet heard from him. Miss Reeves, I find myself in a strange position. I've spent 15 years building a reputation for careful, measured decisions, weighing every risk before I commit to anything. And in the space of 2 weeks, I've discovered I'd burn every careful habit I own, without a second thought, if it meant standing beside you through whatever comes next. Abigail felt her breath catch something warm and frightening unfurling in her chest, that she had spent 11 years training herself not to feel precisely, because feeling it had cost her so dearly the last time. That's a considerable admission, Mr. Ashford, for a man who prides himself on careful decisions. I'm aware. A small, unguarded smile crossed his face, the first she'd seen from him since this whole ordeal began. I don't intend to press you for an answer to anything today, Miss Reeves. You've earned the right to simply breathe after everything this week has asked of you. But I wanted you to know plainly, since plainness seems to be the language we've built between us, I don't intend to let this end simply because the contract's been fixed and Caldwell's been exposed. Whatever this has become between us, I'd like the chance to see where it goes if you'll allow it. Abigail looked out over the dispersing crowd at Ruth, laughing with the very women who'd whispered about her a week before at Josiah Tanner, walking toward his wagon, with his hat set at a prouder angle than she'd seen it all morning, at the whole shifting shape of a county, recalculating in real time exactly how wrong it had been about her. I'd like that too, Mr. Ashford, she said quietly. But I find I'd like to finish this first properly. There are 10 other families you mentioned, and a company's assets frozen pending investigation and land that needs restoring to people who never should have lost it. I don't think I could give my whole heart to anything else, not honestly, until that's finished. Then we'll finish it together, Nathaniel said, and take our time with the rest. She nodded, and for a long moment neither of them said anything further. Standing together on the courthouse steps, in the heavy summer air, the storm that had threatened all morning finally beginning softly to break over the rooftops of Richmond, and Abigail found she did not mind the rain at all. The rain that had threatened all morning broke fully within the hour, and by the time Nathaniel's carriage carried them back toward Ashford Hall, it was coming down in the hard, steady sheets that Virginia summers were known for, the kind of rain that cleared the air rather than simply wetting it. Abigail sat with her hands folded in her lap, watching the water streak the carriage window, and found herself for the first time in longer than she could remember entirely uncertain what to feel. Relief sat beside exhaustion. Vindication sat beside a fear that refused to fully release its grip, because a man like Silas Caldwell rarely surrendered a fight, simply because a magistrate had ruled against him once. She was right not to trust the quiet. It took the county sheriff only 2 days to run down the man who'd set the fire at the recorder's office, a hired laborer named Croft, who'd been paid by his own frightened confession $20, and the promise of steady work to douse the record room in oil and strike a match before dawn, and another 10 to break into old Bellamy's cottage and carry off anything that looked like paper. Croft was not a clever man, and he had not been clever about hiding his sudden new boots or the coin he'd spent too freely at the tavern the very night of the fire, and once the sheriff's questions grew pointed, he gave up the name of the man who'd hired him without much persuasion at all. Caldwell's man. The sheriff told Nathaniel and Abigail standing in the study at Ashford Hall, with his hat still in his hands, rain dripping from the brim onto the floorboards. Not Caldwell himself, mind you. A fellow named Briggs does odd work for half the wealthy men in this county when they need something done that won't bear their own name attached to it. But Briggs took his instructions and his coin directly from Silas Caldwell, according to Croft, and Croft's willing to swear to it before Holloway, provided the court goes easy on him for his part in it. Will Briggs talk? Nathaniel asked. Briggs has already run Mr. Ashford. Left town the morning after the hearing, according to his landlady. I've sent word to the county line, but I wouldn't hold my breath waiting on him to be caught quick. A man paid to disappear usually knows how to do it well. Abigail felt something cold settle in her chest. Then Caldwell has a way to distance himself from the fire entirely. Croft can only say what Briggs told him, and Briggs is gone. That's about the shape of it, ma'am. Croft's testimony ties Briggs to the fire plain enough, but Briggs is the only man who could tie Caldwell to Briggs, and he's in the wind. The sheriff shook his head. I'm sorry to bring you news that's only half good. After he left, Nathaniel stood a long while at the window, watching the rain, his jaw working the way it did when he was turning a problem over, without finding a shape to it he liked. He'll say it was Briggs acting alone, Abigail said quietly. Some grudge of his own, some scheme Caldwell knew nothing about. He'll say exactly that. Nathaniel's voice was tight. And with Briggs gone, there won't be a soul left standing to contradict him on the fire, whatever the ledger and the surveys already proved about the land fraud. Then we let the land fraud stand on its own, Abigail said, though even as she said it, she understood how thin a comfort that was. Croft's testimony would establish who set the fire. It would very likely never establish beyond Caldwell's easy denial that he'd ordered it. And a man who had already lost his company, his fortune, and his standing over the surveys had very little left to lose by escaping the arson charge clean. It was, she thought, exactly the kind of gap a man like Caldwell had spent his whole life learning to slip through. The investigation into Piedmont Land and Canal moved faster than the arson case, if only because Charles Ferris's ledger left considerably less room for denial. Within a week, the state's attorney had opened a formal inquiry into the company's holdings, and within two Caldwell's assets, not merely the shares in Piedmont, but the greater portion of his personal fortune tangled. As it was with the company's finances, had been frozen pending a full accounting. Abigail spent those 2 weeks in the recorder's office nearly every day, working alongside a clerk sent up from Richmond to help reconstruct what records could still be salvaged from the fire, using her own transcriptions as the backbone of an effort to trace every parcel Piedmont had touched. The number, once fully counted, was worse than she'd feared. Not 11 families, 17 stretching back nearly 5 years, some so quietly and cleverly executed that even the families themselves had never suspected the boundary lines they'd accepted without question were anything but honest. She met most of them in the weeks that followed. A widow named Hartley, who'd lost the good half of her late husband's tobacco field to a boundary correction she'd never thought to question. A young farmer named Wexler, newly married, who'd nearly given up his claim to a strip of pasture entirely rather than pay a lawyer he couldn't afford to fight a survey he didn't understand. An older couple, the Doyles, who wept openly when Abigail explained gently exactly how their creekside acreage had been taken from them because they had spent 3 years believing the loss was simply their own carelessness in never having the old grant properly reviewed. We thought we'd misremembered, Mrs. Doyle said, her hands twisting in her apron. Thought maybe father-in-law's memory of the boundary was wrong, God rest him, and we'd been foolish not to check it sooner ourselves. You weren't foolish, Mrs. Doyle, Abigail said, sitting with her at the kitchen table, the same posture she'd once occupied at her own kitchen table, with Ruth shelling peas and believing herself forgotten by the whole world. You trusted the county's own records to protect you the same as any honest person would. The dishonesty was never yours to carry. It became over those weeks something like a calling she hadn't known she was reaching for, not merely correcting old wrongs on paper, but sitting with the people those wrongs had touched, explaining in plain language what had been done to them and what could still be undone, and watching family by family. The particular relief of people who had quietly accepted an injustice finally being told by someone who'd taken the trouble to prove it, that the injustice had a name and a cause, and was not after all some inevitable misfortune they'd simply have to endure. Nathaniel funded the restitution himself quietly without asking credit for it, hiring the lawyers needed to formally return each disputed parcel, covering the court costs that families like the Tanners and the Doyles could never have managed on their own. When Abigail asked him about it, a little uncertainly, worried she'd overstepped by assuming his generosity extended that far, he only shrugged, uncomfortable with the thanks. My father built this family's fortune trading fairly with people who had every reason not to trust a rich man's word, he said. I told Charlotte as much that night in my study. I don't intend to let that be only a thing I said to win an argument. I intend to make it true. Charlotte came to Ashford Hall 3 weeks after the hearing unannounced, and Abigail happened to be in the front hall when she arrived, sorting through a stack of restitution papers bound for the county clerk. For a moment, the two women simply looked at each other. The memory of that first cold encounter, the clever spinster tell me, did my brother explain the impropriety sitting plainly between them. Miss Reeves? Charlotte's voice was careful, stripped of its old edge. I wonder if I might have a word. They went to the small sitting room off the front hall, and Charlotte stood a long moment before she spoke again, her composure visibly costing her something. I owe you an apology, she said finally. I said a great many unkind things about you before I understood what you were actually risking and what you actually found. I was frightened for my family's name, and I let that fear make me cruel to a woman who was, as it turns out, the only person willing to do the difficult, dangerous work of protecting what our family's name should have stood for all along. You were protecting the people you love, Miss Ashford. I understand that fear better than you might think, perhaps. But I said it to your face in this very house on your first morning here, and I've thought of it with considerable shame ever since. Charlotte's chin lifted, some of her old sharpness returning, though gentler now. I've heard what you've done these last weeks. The Tanners, the Doyles, the Hartley widow. 17 families, and you sat with every one of them yourself when you could have simply handed the legal work to a lawyer and been done with it. I wanted them to understand what happened to them. Not merely to have it corrected, but to understand it so no one could ever quietly do it to them again. That's more than most people with your knowledge would trouble themselves to give. Charlotte extended her hand, a formal gesture, but a genuine one. I'd like to start over, Miss Reeves, if you'll allow it. Whatever my brother decides regarding his own feelings toward you, and I confess watching him this past month, I don't believe that decision is much in doubt. I find I'd rather have you as a friend than continue as a fool who judged you before she knew a single true thing about you. Abigail took her hand, and something in her chest, some old guarded wariness she'd carried since her first morning at Ashford Hall, finally fully released. I'd like that very much, Miss Ashford. Charlotte, please. If we're to be sisters eventually, I'd rather not spend the next 40 years on formalities. Abigail felt heat rise in her cheeks. Miss Ashford, Charlotte, nothing has been decided yet between your brother and myself. Hasn't it? Charlotte's smile was sly, now warmer than anything she'd shown Abigail before. I've known my brother 31 years, Miss Reeves. I have never once seen him fight this hard risk this much for anything that wasn't already decided in his own heart, whatever careful words he's using to give you room to decide yours. The trial of Silas Caldwell, for what the fraud investigation ultimately determined to be a scheme spanning 5 years and 17 families, involving forged survey language, fraudulent land transfers, and the deliberate concealment of a company's true ownership, began in late August, under a Richmond courtroom too small to hold the crowd that wanted to witness it. Abigail testified again, this time, not as an accused woman defending her own name, but as the state's expert witness on the pattern of altered surveys, and she delivered her testimony with a calm, methodical precision that left little room for doubt. Pruitt testified as well, and this time with the state's own prosecutor guiding his account, rather than a magistrate's courtroom crowded with skeptical neighbors. His testimony carried the full weight it deserved. Bellamy, frail but resolute, gave his account of final time, and Charles Ferris's ledger was entered into evidence, along with a growing stack of corroborating documents the state's investigators had uncovered in the weeks since the fire. Caldwell's lawyer, a sharp Richmond man with a reputation for extracting acquittals from cases that looked on paper entirely lost, fought hard and fought cleverly, arguing repeatedly that no single piece of evidence taken alone proved Caldwell's direct involvement, that Pruitt was a frightened accomplice, shifting blame, that Bellamy's memory was the failing recollection of an old man, that Ferris was a disgruntled employee, inventing a story to explain away his own complicity in the company's finances. It was, Abigail thought, watching the defense work precisely the strategy Caldwell had used against her in Holloway's courtroom, chip away at each piece individually, and hope the jury never stepped back far enough to see how completely the pieces fit together as a whole. The jury did not make that mistake. After 11 days of testimony, they deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts: forgery, fraudulent conveyance, conspiracy to defraud, and Silas Caldwell was sentenced to 7 years in the state penitentiary, along with a judgment requiring the full restitution of every parcel improperly acquired through Piedmont Land and Canal, and a fine that, combined with the state's seizure of his remaining assets, left him, by the time the courtroom finally emptied, very nearly as landless as the families he'd spent 5 years quietly stealing from. He did not look at Abigail when the verdict was read. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not need him to. The arson charge, exactly as the sheriff had feared, never fully attached to Caldwell himself. Briggs was never found, and Croft's testimony, while enough to convict Croft of the actual fire setting, could not on its own establish Caldwell's direct order beyond reasonable doubt in a separate proceeding. But it hardly mattered in the end. The fraud conviction alone was enough to end him entirely, and Abigail found, standing outside the courthouse in the last warm days of that Virginia summer, that she had stopped needing every last piece of justice to land perfectly in order to feel finally that justice had been done. "It isn't everything," Nathaniel said quietly, standing beside her as the crowd dispersed. "I know you wanted the fire answered too." "It's enough," Abigail said, and found, saying it, that she meant it entirely. 17 families have their land back, or will have it within the month. A man who spent 5 years believing himself untouchable has learned plainly that he wasn't. "I've learned some things don't have to be perfect to be finished, Mr. Ashford. I spent 11 years believing I had to prove myself flawlessly completely before anyone would take my worth seriously. I don't believe that anymore. What do you believe now?" She considered the question a long moment, watching the last of the courtroom crowd scatter into the Richmond streets, watching Ruth already deep in conversation with Mrs. Doyle a little distance away, the two of them laughing at something Abigail couldn't hear. "I believe," she said slowly, "that a person's worth was never something that needed proving in the first place, only something that needed the chance to be seen." The weeks after the trial settled into something Abigail had never quite experienced before, a life with room in it. She continued her work reviewing land records for the county, formerly retained, now paid a proper wage. Her name printed plainly on every certified document she completed. Word of what she'd done spread beyond Richmond into the surrounding counties, and by early autumn she'd received 2 more offers of employment from neighboring recorders, wanting the same careful eye turned on their own record books in case Caldwell's scheme had reached further than anyone yet knew. But it was a different kind of work that came to occupy her thoughts most in the quiet evenings at Ashford Hall, where she'd taken to reviewing correspondence with Nathaniel long after the day's formal business concluded. She thought often of the Doyle daughters, 2 girls of 11 and 13, who couldn't read the very grant that had determined their family's fortune, who'd had to rely entirely on Abigail's word for what the old French described, because no one had ever thought it necessary to teach them. She thought of Mrs. Hartley's niece, sharp-eyed and curious, who'd hovered at the edge of every conversation Abigail had with her aunt, clearly hungry for something no one in her circumstances had ever offered her the chance to reach for. She raised it with Nathaniel one evening in October, tentative at first, the way she'd learned to raise ideas she wasn't yet certain deserved to be taken seriously. "I've been thinking," she said, "about a school." "Go on." "Not a grand academy. Something modest here in Richmond for girls who'd otherwise never have the chance to learn beyond their letters reading sums enough language and law to understand a contract or a land grant before they sign their name to something that cost them everything, the way it nearly cost the Tanners and the Doyles and a dozen others." She watched his face carefully, and she watched, bracing for the gentle dismissal she'd half expected from every man she'd ever raised an ambitious idea to before. "I know it's a considerable undertaking. I don't have the means to fund it properly on my own, not yet, and I understand if I'll fund it," Nathaniel said so immediately and so plainly that Abigail stopped mid-sentence. "You haven't even heard the whole of what I'm proposing." "I don't need to hear the whole of it, Miss Reeves. I've watched you spend 5 months proving over and over exactly what happens when a woman's mind is given room to work, instead of being told from the cradle that it isn't worth cultivating. I can think of no better use of this family's fortune than making certain that lesson reaches further than the 2 of us." He reached across the small distance between their chairs and took her hand, an easy, familiar gesture now, worn smooth by months of exactly this kind of quiet evening. "Build your school, Abigail. Whatever it costs, whatever it takes. I'll stand behind it the same as I stood behind you in that courtroom." It was, she realized, the first time he'd used her given name without the formal miss before it, and something in her chest turned over warm and unguarded at the small deliberate intimacy of it. "Nathaniel," she said, testing the shape of his name in her own mouth the same way, and watched something soften entirely in his face at the sound of it. The school opened in the spring in a modest building just off Richmond's main square that Nathaniel had purchased and renovated over the winter months, and Abigail stood at its door on the first morning with a knot of nervous excitement in her stomach that reminded her oddly of the first morning she'd walked through Ashford Hall's front door nearly a year before. 12 girls arrived that first day, the Doyle daughters among them, and Mrs. Hartley's curious niece and several others whose families had heard through the particular grapevine that carried news through Richmond's farms and back roads that a woman who'd once been called the county's most unmarriageable spinster had built something that might change what their own daughters were allowed to become. Ruth came too, not as a student, but as the school's housekeeper. And within a month, its most enthusiastic advocate, fussing over the girls with the same fierce, practical warmth she'd once reserved entirely for Abigail alone. "Your father would have loved this," Ruth said, standing beside Abigail in the schoolroom doorway that first morning, watching 12 girls settle nervously into their seats, dictionaries and slates arranged before them. "Loved seeing his lessons carried forward into a room full of girls who'll never have to sit alone with their books the way you did, wondering if anyone would ever think what they knew was worth anything." "I think about that often," Abigail admitted. "How different it might have been if there'd been a room like this for me at 11 years old, instead of just my father's study and his patients." "Maybe. But maybe you needed to walk that lonely road first so you'd know exactly what kind of room to build once you had the chance." Ruth squeezed her hand. "Everything happens in its proper season, Miss Abigail. Even the hard parts. Especially the hard parts sometimes." So, Nathaniel proposed in late June, nearly a full year after he'd first stood on her porch in the dark hat in his hands, asking a stranger to trust a man from a town that had already taught her exactly how little trust men deserved. He did it plainly without ceremony, which Abigail understood by then was exactly the kind of proposal that suited them both. No grand gathering, no rehearsed speech delivered before an audience. Simply the two of them in the schoolroom after the last of the girls had gone home for the evening. Abigail still gathering slates and dictionaries. Nathaniel leaning against the doorframe, watching her with an expression she'd come to know well over the past year. "I've been thinking," he said, echoing deliberately the words she'd used to raise the school itself, "about a partnership." Abigail looked up, catching the small, hopeful smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, and set down the slate she was holding. "Go on. Not a grand arrangement. Something honest, built on the same terms we've built everything else between us. Plainness, respect, and a fair accounting of what each of us brings to it." He crossed the room, closing the distance between them, and took both her hands in his. "I don't need a wife who stands behind me managing a household, while I manage the world beyond it, Abigail. I've watched what happens when a woman's mind is given the full room to work, and I find I have no interest in a marriage that would ask you to fold any part of yourself smaller to fit inside it. I need someone beside me, someone whose judgment I trust as thoroughly as my own, who'll tell me the truth even when it costs her something to say it the way you've done since the very first night you stood on your porch and told me plainly you wouldn't be anybody's hidden advantage again." Meh. Abigail felt her eyes fill, unexpected and entirely unashamed. "That's a considerable proposal, Mr. Ashford." "I'm aware." His thumb traced gently across her knuckles, ink-stained, still a year of honest work worn permanently into her hands. "I love you, Abigail Reeves. Not despite the sharpness this county once feared in you, and not despite the years it spent teaching you to hide your own mind for fear of frightening off a husband. I love you because of exactly that sharpness, exactly that mind, exactly the courage it took you to walk through my front door in daylight, when it would have been so much safer to stay home and let the world go on forgetting you. Marry me. Build this life with me plainly, honestly, as an equal partner in every part of it, the school, the estate, whatever comes next that neither of us has thought to imagine yet." "Yes," Abigail said before he'd even finished the question properly, the word coming easily and certainly from somewhere far deeper than the careful caution she'd spent 11 years building around her own heart. "Yes, Nathaniel, I'll marry you." He kissed her, then gentle and unhurried in the quiet schoolroom surrounded by the dictionaries and slates of 12 girls who would grow up because of the choice she'd made a year before, to walk through a stranger's front door rather than stay safely forgotten, believing entirely that a woman's mind was worth every bit as much as the world around her. Jack. They married in September in a small ceremony at Ashford Hall that Charlotte helped plan with an enthusiasm that made plain exactly how completely her early suspicion had transformed into genuine affection. Ruth stood at Abigail's side, weeping openly through the whole of it. And Josiah Tanner and his wife came, and the Doyles and Mrs. Hartley and her niece, and a dozen others whose land had been restored, and whose lives had been quietly, permanently changed by a translator's careful eye and a landowner's willingness to risk everything he had for the truth. Elias Pruitt came too, standing, a little apart from the crowd, still carrying the visible weight of what he'd survived, but standing there nonetheless, because Abigail had insisted gently but firmly that a man who had found the courage to tell the truth, however late, deserved to witness what that courage had helped build. "You look happy, Mr. Pruitt," she said, finding him near the edge of the gathering, a cup of cider in his hand he hadn't yet touched. "I am Mrs. Ashford." He tested the new name carefully, and something in his young face, still shadowed by everything he'd carried, eased slightly at the sound of it. "I've taken a position clerking for a lawyer in Petersburg. Honest work this time. I mean to keep it that way, whatever it costs me." "I believe you will." Abigail touched his arm gently. "You paid a steep price for your courage, Mr. Pruitt. I hope it's brought you some measure of peace in the end." "More than I expected, ma'am. I sleep easier now than I have in 3 years." He looked past her to where the wedding party had gathered, beneath the September sky, laughter carrying easily across the lawn. "I'm glad I was wrong about how this would end. I spent so long believing the truth would only ruin me. I never once imagined it might build something like this instead." Old Mr. Bellamy did not live to see the following spring. His health, already frail before the break-in at his cottage, finally failed him that winter, quietly in his sleep with his grandson at his side. Abigail wept at his funeral more than she expected to, understanding in the particular grief of losing someone who had risked everything to stand beside her at exactly the moment she needed it most, that some debts could never be fully repaid, only honored. She named the school's first scholarship fund after him, a small stipend, to cover books and tuition for any girl in the county whose family couldn't otherwise afford the fee, and stood at its founding with Nathaniel's hand in hers, thinking of a frail old man in a trembling chair, who had told her on the worst afternoon of the whole ordeal that a false line on a survey could starve a man's children as surely as a bad harvest, and that he did not intend to be a coward twice in one lifetime. He hadn't been. And because he hadn't, 17 families kept their land, and a dozen girls learned their letters in a schoolroom that wouldn't have existed without his courage. And Abigail understood more clearly than she'd understood anything in her whole guarded, careful life. That truth, once spoken plainly enough and defended fiercely enough, had a way of outlasting every lie built to bury it. 2 years after that first knock on her father's door, Abigail Ashford stood once more in the doorway of her schoolroom, watching a new class of girls settle into their seats for the first morning of the term, nearly 30. Now, the school having grown considerably beyond its first modest 12, funded in part by Nathaniel's fortune, and in part increasingly by grateful families who'd once been strangers to her and were now something closer to kin. Her own daughter, not yet 2 years old, slept in Ruth's arms near the back of the room, and Nathaniel stood beside her in the doorway, watching the same scene with an expression of quiet, unguarded pride that still, after 2 years of marriage, made something warm and certain settle in Abigail's chest every time she caught it. "Your father would be proud of all this," Nathaniel said, softly echoing Ruth's words from that very first morning. "Not just the school, the whole of what you built out of what this town once tried to convince you was worthless." Abigail looked out at the rows of girls at slates and dictionaries, and eager, uncertain faces, at a room full of futures that would never again be limited by what this county had once decided a woman's mind was worth. "I used to believe," she said slowly, "that being overlooked was the worst thing that could happen to a person, that if the world refused to see you, refused to value what you knew, there was nothing left to do but grow smaller, quieter, safer, until the disappointment stopped mattering so much." She reached for Nathaniel's hand, steady and certain, in a way that would have been unimaginable to the woman who'd torn a rejection letter to pieces in her father's study 2 years and a lifetime ago. "I know better now. Being overlooked was never the end of the story. It was only ever the beginning of one waiting for someone brave enough to prove the world wrong." The morning bell rang, calling the schoolroom to order, and Abigail Ashford, once the county's most unmarriageable spinster, once a woman the world had decided wasn't worth a second glance, now a wife, a mother, a teacher, and the reason 17 families still held the land that was rightfully theirs, stepped into the room to begin the day's lesson, certain at last and forever that a mind sharpened by courage could never again be dismissed, overlooked, or taken from her.